Chapter 743. Brando was silent and didn't answer. Of course Duke Erek would come. This was a good show he had planned. He would assassinate the princess who was gradually slipping out of his control and regain control of Prince Haruz's government. No, in this case, it was Princess Bessidine. Brando looked back at Haruz, who was standing beside him. The little prince looked up at his sister in another time and space. His expression was as if he was in the clouds. The princess' expression was colder. She looked at Haruz with a complicated expression in her pale silver eyes. Ever since Bessidine and I escaped from Kintan Palace together in the year of flowers and summer leaves, you've, me, and Erwin have all been through a lot. You've grown up too. Bessidine, it's time to take responsibility. Sister, Princess Griffin raised a hand to interrupt him. She turned back and said to Brando, Viscount, I would like to speak with Bessidine alone for a moment. Brando thought for a moment. This was just a corner of the dream. There wasn't much point in him staying here. The only way to leave this place was to make up for Viscount Caldel's regrets. He had to find more clues from the scenes in the dream. So he nodded and said to Haruz, Bessidine, you stay here. You haven't seen the princess in a long time. I'll wait for you in the hall outside. Caldel. Haruz turned back to look at his teacher. His young eyes were full of panic and unease, but in Princess Griffin's eyes, they were like the reluctance of a lover. She shook her head imperceptibly and sighed softly. Let the Viscount be alone for a while. You still have a long time, Bessidine. Haruz's face was red. Because of the misunderstanding, he was still a boy. But he couldn't explain himself. He could only stare at Brando with pleading eyes. Brando quietly gestured to Haruz. It was the Tree Elf's code. He knew this in his previous life and naturally taught it to his only student. Brando told Haruz to stay here, collect information, and then meet up with him. There was still uneasiness on the young prince's face, but when he saw Brando's gesture, he suddenly remembered why they had come. He took a deep breath and finally calmed down. She nodded at him. Brando's gaze returned to Princess Griffin, or rather, the image of Her Royal Highness in his memory. He was fully aware of how important this shadow was in his heart. She had truly changed the values of many people. Her Royal Highness, who had completely shouldered the burden of the kingdom, had a unique charm. It was just like the temperament of a calm lake in his memory, but under the surface of the lake, there was a strength as strong as the sea. She stood there, independent of the world. She looked at the kingdom with calm, wise eyes. She had used her life to bring it back from decay and finally watched it be destroyed. In the last days of her life, the princess often thought quietly alone. But what was she thinking about? Was it regret? Was it reminiscence? Or was she using her calm mind to arrange all the escape routes? The nobles who once supported her eventually stood against her. The only ones who supported her were the players. It seemed like a great irony that a group of historical passers-by had feelings for a virtual character. But Her Royal Highness just watched it all quietly and quietly completed her mission. She understood her fate from beginning to end and accepted it calmly as if she was just reading a book with words. But in the end, she left a seed for Erwin. The cowardly and incompetent prince grew up under her wing and finally took responsibility. This was the land that gave birth to her, but she grew up under the indifferent education of the nobles. What made her selflessly want to change all this? Was it just because of a noble ideal? Brando pursed his lips. He did not have a noble ideal, just like all the players. Although King Erwin's dream had made every Erwin player's blood boil and passed on such an oath. But were their feelings really fighting for the people at the bottom? How many people really had the sentiments of a revolutionary? It was not possible in reality, let alone in a game. The players just described a romantic picture of knight doctrine in their hearts. He was the same. His yearning for the heroic plot and his special feelings for Her Royal Highness and the Valkyrie led him to this step. He never forgot his own heart and carefully prevented himself from falling into self-righteousness. What he pursued in his heart was still the oath that the senior sister said to explore the end of the world together. It was just a small and even a little ridiculous wish. But it was precisely because of this that true self-sacrifice in this world was so holy and respectable. Brando bowed deeply to Her Royal Highness. It had nothing to do with class or the role he played. It was as if he was worshipping the person who pursued the beautiful belief and the pure ideal in his heart. Then he looked back and felt that everything in the past had disappeared in his heart. It was a special feeling, as if a burden had been lifted. The past had disappeared, and what was left was a new future. Brando walked out of the garden with a relaxed and heavy mood, only to see Black Tea waiting for him there. Black Tea saw him and straightened up from the pillar. "You really came out, Lord Viscount. You were waiting for me. I think Her Royal Highness must have something to say to her sister, right? They haven't seen each other for a long time." Her Royal Highness didn't inform anyone else that Princess Bessidine was coming. "No one knew except for us." Black Tea giggled and replied somewhat proudly. Her performance was almost exactly the same as in Brando's impression. "Her Royal Highness trusts you. That's because we are trustworthy." The nobles are now on Grand Duke Arek's side. They hope that Her Royal Highness can stop those reforms. In the end, it's because Her Royal Highness's actions hurt their interests. Black Tea snorted with some dissatisfaction. This history was so similar, almost exactly the same as in Brando's memory. But he was more concerned about another answer. He asked, "But no matter what kind of reform it is, it will be beneficial to the people at the bottom. There will always be people who will support Her Royal Highness." "They?" The girl gritted her teeth. "If those people are really reliable, Her Royal Highness wouldn't have fallen to such a state. Her Royal Highness can sacrifice herself for them, but is there anyone who is willing to sacrifice their life for Her Royal Highness?" This argument was so familiar. Didn't he once think so too? No, perhaps this was his subconscious thought, but he just said it through the mouth of Black Tea in his memory. Why was that? Was it really like what Black Tea said later, that human nature was selfish? He was also disappointed because of this. He left Erewhon, who had turned to ashes, and went north. But he was just like a lonely ghost wandering in the world of the game. But this time, Brando hesitated and said, "Maybe there's another reason." Hearing his answer, Black Tea raised her head and looked at him carefully. She narrowed her eyes slightly, looking like a feline before a hunt. "Actually, that's not what you think in your heart, right?" The young girl smiled and said in an enigmatic manner, "Because I saw confusion in your eyes. Also, you're the same as us. Even though you're just an NPC, I can smell the same scent on you as us." This sentence made Brando's heart skip a beat. "You're the same as us. Even though you're just an NPC, I can smell the same scent on you as us." If this wasn't Black Tea, she wouldn't be that smart. This was his own question. No, not only that, this was Caldel's own question. Brando faintly felt that he had grasped something. What kind of answer was that knight, who had lost his reputation and memories, looking for from him? The two walked into the main hall of the banquet. As the guards responsible for the safety of the Kinten Palace and having the complete trust of the Princess Regent, the members of the Crimson Travelers were able to move freely in the banquet. As for Brando, he was an invited guest. The center of the banquet was a huge dance floor. Countless nobles gathered around this circle, chatting with each other in twos and threes. They only had their own circle of friends, but occasionally, they would enter other circles to greet guests that they were familiar with or had only met once. Banquets were an important way for nobles to communicate. Many enemies and allies were born at these banquets. Huge, gorgeous chandeliers lit up the entire hall. Brando's eyes were filled with extravagance. It was as if he couldn't tell that the kingdom was struggling at death's door from the brilliant lights. But he had seen it all before, and now he was just reliving it. He walked aimlessly through the crowd, subconsciously trying to find Enrich and his secret assassin. In reality, Enrich had given him a lot of trouble. He didn't think that he would continue to be his enemy in the dream. This guy was really despicable to Brando. But Brando also paid attention to every detail around him. Viscount Caldel's memories were scattered in this huge dream. Any detail could trigger his memories of the past and cause the scene in the dream to change. Hard work paid off. Very soon, he found some changes. The clock in the middle of the hall pointed to 8 in the evening. This was 2 hours away from when the banquet started in his memory. Looking out from the arched windows on the north side of the Kinten Palace, he should be able to see the palace complex and large gardens. But Brando only saw a dense forest when he stood there. The sky was pitch black. There was a faint smell of blood in the air, as well as a charred smell that seemed to come from something that had been burnt. The time on the clock, the forest outside the window that didn't match his memory, the strangeness in the air. Brando guessed that these were probably Viscount Caldel's memories from when he was alive. The fact that he could find these memory fragments meant that they must be more important memories in his heart and left a deep impression. So Brando also silently remembered these points. Then, he took a step back and unexpectedly bumped into someone. "Ouch!" a young voice called out. Brando felt the person bump into his waist. It was probably a child. He guessed that the person was carrying a plate of food because he heard the clatter of cutlery falling to the ground. P.S. Carvin == last page. I must find a way to bring this month's average to 6 to 7K per day. Talk about being despicable. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 744. Brando turned back to look at the child who had bumped into him. The boy had already fallen down on the thick and soft carpet in the hall. He was about 7 or 8 years old, with a head of black hair. Under his small sword-shaped eyebrows, there was a kind of unswerving determination hidden in his big, dark eyes. The little boy looked at him with some uncertainty. He was wearing the kind of silk attendant uniform that the children of noble families often wore, white tight pants, and a pair of pointed boots inlaid with jewels and gold leaf. Silver plates were scattered around him, and all kinds of dishes were spilled all over the floor. The red sauce slowly seeped into the carpet. Time seemed to have stopped for a moment. It would cost a lot of money to replace the expensive camel fur carpet, because this kind of handmade carpet was only produced in the Silver Bay. Merchants used tamed beasts to carry this kind of exquisite fabric across the desert, passing thousands of miles to Erewhon, just to make a huge profit that was more expensive than gold. This strange thought flashed through Brando's mind for a moment. The little boy looked familiar to him. He narrowed his eyes and was trying to recall where he had seen him before. At this moment, a gentle voice interrupted, "Sir, I'm sorry." Brando's every pore seemed to shrink, and his muscles and skin tightened together. He stiffly raised his head in the direction of the voice, and then his whole body was nailed there. It was a noble couple, dressed in clothes that suited this era, which was the style that Erewhon imitated from the upper class of the Wind Elves in the later period of the Renaissance. They helped the little boy up and smiled apologetically at Brando. Sophie quickly apologized to him. "Look, you've dirted this gentleman's clothes." Brando looked at this scene in silence. Although 2 words that were deeply engraved in his memory were churning in his heart, as if they were going to burst out at any time, he just couldn't say it. Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that he would see his parents in his dreams at this time and in such an environment. The noble couple in front of him was exactly the same as the 2 faces in his memory, and even younger. Or it could be said that they were almost the same as his childhood memories. Yes, at that time, he was only 7 or 8 years old. He often went to the amusement park near his home with his parents. He glanced at the little boy. "I'm sorry, sir." The young Sophie patted the dirt off her body, raised her head and apologized to him in a tone that was neither servile nor overbearing. Brando pursed his lips quietly. He knew that this was himself in his heart, and also his parents in his heart, because this was his confusion in this dream. There was a fog in the hearts of mortals, and this fog existed in the dreams of the lost names, and no one knew when it would envelop you. And now, he was walking into the fog that he had always been unwilling to face. The mortal's greatest enemy was probably himself, because only he knew what he was most afraid of. And this nightmare was just like the description, hitting the weakest spot in his heart. Brando forced a smile from his stiff face. "It's okay." He tried hard to control himself so that he would not act so out of place, but in fact, he immediately wanted to find an excuse to escape. He saw the way his parents looked at his young self. It was a look of protection and hope, and Brando knew what that look meant. "Sir, you seem to have something on your mind." His mother looked at him and asked. "No, no." Brando almost lost his composure and quickly shook his head. "It's normal for young people to have things on their minds. You may not believe it, but my husband and I feel a little close to you when we see you. So please give us a chance to apologize. Can we invite you to sit over there for a while?" The familiar face of the woman in his memory looked at him somewhat kindly, but it was the kind of eyes with tolerance and kindness that almost made him collapse. Brando took a deep breath and let the cold air seep into his lungs to calm himself down. "Of course, it's my pleasure, but I still have some things to take care of. I'm really sorry, I can only take my leave." With that, he bowed deeply to the couple, then turned and ran away as if he was running away, as if he was afraid that if he stayed a moment longer, his original identity would be exposed. If that was the case, he did not even know how he should face them. He was following the shining trajectory in that world, changing the fate of this ancient kingdom. But was all of this really meaningful? For a moment, he even felt lost. Could he really answer them without any regrets? Was all of this meaningful? Or perhaps he had been wrong from the very beginning. Was everything he had been pursuing real or not? For the first time, Brando was not so sure in his heart. He did not even dare to look back. He plunged into the crowd, sweating profusely. Even after the battle in Ampere Seal, he had never been so uneasy. He looked at the faces of the nobles, some distorted and magnified, as if they were the images of demons. There seemed to be a voice calling him, dragging him to hell. "Teacher." The voice suddenly became clear, as if it had strength, and grabbed his arm. As a strong person who had activated his elemental power, Brando was almost pulled to the ground. He turned his head back, sweating profusely. The first thing he saw was a slender arm with a long silver glove. He looked up and saw the clear eyes of His Highness the Prince. "Teacher." Heureuse looked at him worriedly. "Heureuse?" Brando was slightly startled and finally woke up. He looked up and did not see the figure of Princess Griffine, so he asked, "Where's your sister? Have you finished talking to her?" "Almost, but there's something I don't understand." The little prince frowned, showing a deep worry. The way he frowned really resembled his sister, especially the way his neck was slightly bent and his head was lowered under the long silver curly hair. It was exactly the same as Princess Griffine's. Brando was stunned when he saw it. This also dispelled some of the confusion in his heart, calming him down a little. At that moment, he thought of Princess Griffine, of Freya, of the Roman and the mountains of Bucci. These things really existed. Brando felt a little relieved, but he understood that the thorn buried in the bottom of his heart was just hiding its edge. "I understand what you want to know." Brando replied faintly. "What is this place, teacher? Why did it become like this?" Didn't we defeat Duke Cypher in Ampere Seal? Duke Erek has also become a wanted criminal by the Holy Cathedral. As long as the South and North are united, Aween will be able to regain its former glory, won't it? The little prince grabbed his hand tightly, as if he was really a helpless girl. But why did it become like this? I asked my sister. Without Mr. Brando, without the Battle of Ampere Seal, my sister married Duke Erek. The old nobles gathered around the people who gave them the greatest benefits, and even the royal party stood on the opposite side of the kingdom. And Madara. Why did the undead sequence become so powerful? Sister Freya. Sister Freya is also dead. How could this be? We clearly already. Haru's eyes were a little misty. He bit his lip and tried not to cry. My sister said she would die here. Teacher, please save my sister, Brando sighed in his heart. He could understand the despair in the little prince's heart, because they had personally experienced such despair. Their efforts seemed to be negated by an invisible hand, their hopes turned into nothingness, their ideals and beliefs destroyed little by little, and the road ahead seemed to be left with only endless darkness. But if it were not for such hopelessness, how could he have come to this point today? He touched the little prince's head and replied, Haruz, this is just a dream. Have you forgotten what I told you? The unnamed one distorted your dream just to make you fall into it, and all the absurd scenes you see here are his means to confuse you. Haruz looked up at him with red eyes. Teacher, I know, you're actually lying to me, aren't you? These things really happened, although I don't know where they are, maybe in the future, maybe in the past, but I know, they're not all fake. Brando was shocked. He looked at the little prince. Haruz, why do you say that? I don't know. I just have a hunch. I'm a little scared, teacher. As expected of a seer, this was not inferior to the Roman sixth sense. Brando shook his head gently. In the eyes of the ancient Cruz people, history overlaps, because different branches of history will extend to different results. Whenever history goes to a fork, there are two results at the same time node, and the witches believe that each branch will give birth to a new world. These worlds overlap with each other, and we are just passers-by. Brando suddenly thought that maybe there was such a possibility, otherwise it could not explain his experience. But unfortunately, it was just a legend after all, and no one could prove its authenticity. Maybe all this happened in different histories, but it's just a dream after all, and we've changed our own destiny. Didn't Maynard say that we should have a sword in our hands that can change our destiny? Really? Maybe, after all, no one has seen it, Brando replied somewhat guiltily. After regaining his composure, his mentality became more stable. But it was at this moment that he felt the smell of blood and burnt flesh in the air become stronger. He turned around and saw that everyone in the hall was talking loudly, but no one seemed to have noticed it. But at this time, the hall suddenly became quiet. Then the door in the middle of the corridor on the second floor suddenly opened, and a row of knights walked out from behind. Then he saw his senior, Black Tea, and many other familiar faces behind them. They were all from the Crimson Travelers team. Finally, behind everyone, a noble and elegant figure slowly walked out. The hall was silent. Everyone's eyes were focused in that direction. Brando frowned slightly. The scene in his memory was engraved in his heart, and he would never forget it. He subconsciously turned his head in one direction. If he remembered correctly, the assassin would open the door in that direction and sneak into the hall when no one was paying attention. However, what surprised him was that the door was closed, and there was no movement. What's going on? Has history changed? Brando was slightly startled. P.S. Because Carvin is going out tomorrow to find inspiration, he's going to find a place to travel with Blackie. I'll keep updating, but the time of the update may not be fixed. I'll use a notebook at the hotel when the time comes. It may be early or late. I hope everyone will forgive me. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 745. When Erewhon's Princess Royal walked into the second floor of the hall, she seemed to be following Aratha or Launina, the two ice queens. The hall was as silent as winter, and as if a ghost had passed through the crowd, the sound fell and froze into powder. Just as the Myrna people on the glacier said, ghosts can devour human voices. Brando looked away from the ostentatious balcony and happened to meet Griffin's gaze. The fairy princess had one hand on the railing and her gaze was as sharp as a sword. She looked down at him from above, making his heart skip a beat. Brando vaguely felt that there was something different in Princess Griffin's gaze. It was as cold as the gaze of an executioner looking at a prisoner on death row. What's wrong? Whether it was in his previous life or this one, he had never seen the princess look at him with such a gaze. The strange silence only lasted for a moment. Princess Griffin looked away and only then did she officially announce the start of the banquet on the second floor. The musicians seemed to come back to their senses and the melodious sound of the xylophone filled the hall again. Everything before seemed to be an illusion, but as Brendel watched the princess turn around and walk downstairs, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. He turned back and looked at the little prince dressed up as Princess Bessidine beside him and asked, "Haruz, what else did your sister say to you?" "Teacher." Haruz started to speak but stopped. His slender, snow-white neck glistened under the light but it was covered with fine beads of sweat. He looked nervous. At that moment, a dark voice came from behind the two of them and interrupted Haruz. "Lord Viscount." Brando turned back and saw an elderly female official standing behind him and Haruz. The female official wore a light blue ceremonial dress. Her hair was white and every wrinkle on her face seemed to be dignified. Only when she saw them did her serious expression soften slightly and she revealed a polite smile. "Viscount Caldel, Miss Bessidine, Her Highness the Princess is looking for you." "Her Highness the Princess? Looking for us?" "Yes, Her Highness the Princess is waiting for you and Miss Bessidine over there," replied the female official. "What business does Your Highness have with us?" Brando was suspicious. He always felt that Princess Griffin's cold eyes meant something. What's more, Haruz had just left his sister's place, and Her Royal Highness had asked them to come over. Obviously, it was not for her sister. Everything before his eyes was completely different from what had happened in history. Brendel knew that Caldel's own memories were at work here, but it wasn't an easy task to remove these memories from the dream realm and find out what they were pointing to. Brando suddenly thought of a possibility. What if, in this dream, Viscount Caldel is the princess' enemy? If Viscount Caldel was on the opposite side of Griffin, then perhaps the princess's gaze would be easy to understand. But if Viscount Caldel is on the opposite side of the eldest princess, then who could he possibly be? Even though dreams were myths, they wouldn't form on their own. Just like how people couldn't imagine things they hadn't seen before out of thin air. Even fantasy creatures, dragons and ghosts were mostly born from what people had seen and heard in the real world. For example, horses with long horns and birds of prey with the head of an eagle and the body of a lion. In other words, Viscount Caldel's appearance at this banquet was probably to replace another person at this banquet. Who could that person be? Caldel's remaining memories must have picked someone in this scene who had a similar experience to him. This person definitely wouldn't be unknown, because he should at least have some connection to Haruz, who is represented by Princess Bessidine. Brando suddenly remembered something. Before Haruz and Alara got married, he actually had a marriage contract. The marriage contract was with Duke Arek's adopted daughter, a woman named Essay. This woman was really unknown in history, but Brando knew that she was actually an elemental activated wizard. In private, she was an assassin and spy trained by Duke Arek. In other words, if Haruz became Bessidine and became Princess Griffin's sister in this dream, then his identity was very likely Essay in this dream. A spy and assassin on Duke Arek's side. Brando suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. He wondered what Viscount Caldel's unfulfilled wish was. Was it regret from the failed assassination? Or regret from the successful assassination? If it was the former, he shuddered and turned back to look at the second floor again. The tightly shut door was like an ominous sign that haunted his mind. Brando turned back to look at Heroes. If they had to kill Princess Griffin in order to leave this dream, would this little prince be able to accept it? He shook his head inwardly. Lord Viscount. The older female official saw that Brando was lost in thought and asked again. Brando finally turned back and nodded at her, indicating that she should take them to the princess. Just as the female official said, Princess Griffin was indeed waiting for them at the side of the hall. She stood under the oil painting of Anson XI. This ancestor had once brought Erwin a brief resurgence, just like her. And the two of them seemed to have similar endings. The princess looked up at the oil painting and only turned back when she noticed the two approaching. Brando noticed that the coldness in her silver eyes was no longer there. It was as if what he saw before was just an illusion. The eldest princess saw Brando and Heroes and a gentle smile appeared on her face. I've made you wait, Viscount Caldell. The situation is critical now and Bessidine is still young. I had to tell her some things in advance. It's nothing, Brando answered, but he was thinking about his previous guess. If Caldell really was an assassin, then his identity might have been exposed before this. Otherwise, the princess wouldn't have looked like that before. But he was curious about why the eldest princess had called him here now. If she wanted to make a move, the best chance would be when he and Heroes were separated, and not when she had her sister return to his side. Princess Griffin glanced at them and then asked in a small voice, Viscount, do you remember what I said to you before? Which part is your highness referring to? Brando paused slightly. As the substitute of this dream, he had no memory of anything before this. If it was said that everything before was in line with historical developments, he could still make guesses. But now, the entire banquet was completely out of his control. Princess Griffin glanced at him, her eyes mocking. Duke Erec will be here soon. I know he has plans tonight, but I plan to announce your relationship with Bessidine before that. I told you before that if anything happens to me, you and Bessidine can take over the throne and stand out publicly against Erec. Although the nobles have never stood with me, they might not be on Erec's side wholeheartedly. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, Erec has made many enemies and even enemies. Once I die, they definitely won't sit by and watch Erec take the throne. House Cypher has an old grudge against him. I once let my brother go. When I die, he might not be able to become your ally, but he will definitely become Erec's enemy. Also, the old friends of Lantern Island will be your staunch support. Sister. Heroes couldn't help but speak. Bessidine, don't interrupt. Griffin looked at her sister and was a little serious. From today onwards, you must learn to endure. She sighed again, a little tired. I didn't want it to come to this. Madara is watching us covetously. Erwin has actually lost his last chance. But Cruz's people might not be willing to face the undead directly, so they might turn to support you. This is Erwin's last chance. Brando listened to these words quietly on the side. He was a little puzzled. He had already unconsciously taken Viscount Caldell to be that assassin in history. He knew that Princess Griffin probably already knew Viscount Caldell's identity. But what he found strange was, why did she still say these things in front of him? Isn't she afraid that she'll leak the secret? Or does she already think of herself as a dead person? For a moment, Brando couldn't guess what the princess was thinking. But the development of the dream had completely exceeded his understanding. Viscount Caldell's dream, his dream, and Heroes' dream had already overlapped. He could even smell the thick scent of blood in the air. He turned back to look at Heroes. The little princess also looked worried. Princess Griffin seemed to have finished saying her last words. Then she smiled slightly and raised her wine glass to the two of them. Brando knew that the eldest princess in history couldn't have been unaware of her own death. Otherwise, she wouldn't have safely moved her rose out before that. She had actually said what she said today to the core members of the Scarlet Travelers that day, but she hadn't said it so directly. Now that he thought about it, the meaning of the eldest princess' words that day had been very clear. Unfortunately, only his senior sister had noticed some clues. Brando couldn't help but feel a little depressed. He saw the princess' actions and also picked up his wine glass from the silver tray beside him. Although he hadn't paid much attention to it, after months of sudden training from Amandina, he now had a slight grasp of the etiquette between nobles. Viscount Caldel, to you, and also to Bessidine and Erwin. Cheers. The eldest princess looked at him with her silver eyes and raised her wine glass. When she said, to Erwin, she lost control of her emotions slightly but still put the glass to her lips very naturally and took a sip. Brando was about to raise his glass, but at that moment, Heruz suddenly reached out and slapped the glass out of his hand. It fell onto the carpet. You can't drink, teacher. There's poison in the wine, the little prince reminded him in a small voice, a little agitated. Brando paused slightly but didn't look too surprised. He raised his head to look at the princess in front of him. Since he'd guessed Viscount Caldel's identity, he'd already known that there might be something wrong with the wine. He hadn't planned on drinking the wine in the first place, but he didn't think that Heruz would dare to go against his sister's wishes. Although it was just a myth, it was already very rare for the little prince. Bessidine. The princess was completely stunned by her sister's actions. Brando saw her clench her fists and her thin brows almost knitted together. She took a deep breath and then asked coldly, "What are you doing?" "Sister, Mr. Brando wouldn't hurt you." You're wrong. He's not that person." Heruz didn't dare to contradict his sister and could only lower his head and explain in a small voice. "Brando." Princess Griffine paused slightly. She looked at her sister and then at Brando. "Who's that?" "Bessidine, what are you talking about?" No. Only then did Heruz realize that he'd let it slip and quickly corrected himself. "Viscount Caldel, he's a good person." Brando had inexplicably been called a good person. More importantly, this good person card had been given to him by a boy. This made him feel slightly awkward. But he didn't say anything to explain himself. Instead, he quietly watched the scene unfold because in that moment, he could already feel something in the depths of his heart begin to stir. This was the throbbing of a dream. In other words, Viscount Caldel might have personally experienced this scene in a certain era, at a certain banquet. Bessidine was arguing with her sister. This scene brought back Viscount Caldel's memories. Brando could almost feel that this knight, who had lost his reputation, was returning to the era he belonged to. He raised his head and saw that the entire hall was changing. It was gradually changing from the architectural style after Erwin's revival to an even more ancient era. The free style of the glorious Anson XI era disappeared. The banister of the stairs seemed to have become an even more simple wooden product. All the decorations and people's clothes around them were changing. Finally, it was reverting to a style that more accurately, a style that a certain elf lady in Brando's body was very familiar with. The era when the honor of the Wind Elves had returned. It was the elves. Brando had heard Saint Tossel mention the era she lived in many times. Everything in front of him was so familiar, almost exactly the same as what he had heard. He turned his head and saw that Heruz had already blocked Princess Griffine. "Bessidine, he's a Rex assassin. He's no longer the Caldel, you know. He betrayed you a long time ago." "Sister, it can't be, because Brando." "Mr. Caldel, Heruz explained in a small voice. But he suddenly thought of a terrifying possibility. His beautiful face paled instantly. He turned his head and stared at Brando with some fear. "Mr. Brando, you..." At the same time, the throbbing in Brando's heart became even more obvious. He seemed to hear a voice echoing in his heart over and over again. "Kill her. Kill her. Kill them." In that moment, he already knew that it was Viscount Caldel's identity. Brando's hand rested on the scabbard of Halran Gaia. He lowered his eyes slightly. His palms were covered in cold sweat. "What do we do? P.S. You're back. You went out to play and caught a cold. I'm so heartless. I'll write a chapter today. It feels pretty good. Let's see if I can recover tomorrow." "Ah, I'm so sorry. Why is it so hard for me to write and make it so painful for everyone to follow me? I really want to write a bunch of chapters smoothly." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 746. Brando lowered his head, the pupils in his dark brown eyes constricted. They were as still as water, but there was a flickering light in them. One of his hands was tucked under his trench coat, and his exposed left hand hung down naturally. The pale hand was slender like a sword, and the knuckles were as thin as white bones, but they contained strength and were slightly curled. This was the hand of an outstanding swordsman. He stared at Princess Griffin, who was not far away from him, with a complicated look in his eyes. "Teacher." Herose looked up with a pale face and reached out weakly, as if he wanted to grab Brando's hand that was holding the sword, but he grabbed his left wrist instead. He knew that Brando's hand was under the trench coat, perhaps holding the simple cross-shaped hilt. The dark blade of the Halran Gaia was sleeping in the scabbard with dwarf-style patterns, controlled by a stable force. He looked up, his weak pupils dilated, and his forehead was covered with fine beads of sweat. He looked at his teacher with some panic. He shook his head hard, almost with a pleading look. No, that is, he had seen Brando kill with his own eyes. It was a group of cultists he met on his journey. The Count, he knew, his teacher, had changed his usual gentle and polite appearance, just like now, cold as a sharp sword out of its scabbard. When he saw his teacher fighting, he was like an executioner who had abandoned all human emotions. Every sword strike would take away a life. It was so easy that it was as if he was cutting grass on the training ground. In the young prince's memory, there was only one person who fought like this, Maynard. But the female knight was far less skilled than his teacher in controlling his blade so that it could easily cut people's throats, and let the rose-red color spread over the snow-white metal. Air sizzled as it was sucked into the cut trachea, and blood mixed with fragments spurted out of the neck. The lifeless body fell limply to the ground, making a muffled sound like a heavy object falling to the ground. Brando's eyes were as cold as steel. This was the military swordsmanship, he had told him. Herose shuddered in his heart. He looked back at his sister. Although she was a lot different from what he remembered, more mature, more beautiful, and more majestic, she was still his sister, and Herose would never mistake her for someone else. He suddenly remembered what Brando had warned him in advance. The fear in his heart grew stronger, like a vine quietly creeping along the corner of the wall. No matter what, he was not willing to see his sister die in the hands of his teacher. Brando let Herose grab his left hand. He could feel the uneasiness in the young prince's heart. This uneasiness seemed to be contagious. His hand holding the sword was already covered in sweat, soaking the grey wolf leather on the hilt of Halran Gaia. This was Viscount Caldel's dream. It was like the eternal sleep that the witches spoke of. Only the master of the dream could decide when this long dream began and when it ended. But unfortunately, Viscount Caldel had lost himself long ago. His world only existed in this incomplete world of fog. In order to wake him up, he had to find the memories he had been running away from. The only way to escape from here was to wake up. But the master of the dream had lost himself long ago. His world only existed in this incomplete world of fog. In order to wake him up, he had to make up for it. The only way was for him to find himself. Should he complete his unfinished mission? The voice in his heart was almost screaming for him to draw his sword quickly. Viscount Caldel's regret had turned him into a monster filled with anger, regret, jealousy, and negative emotions. He was like a ghoul howling in Brando's heart. Kill her. Kill them. Don't regret it. Don't hesitate. Ah! Brando's hand was on the hilt of the sword. He took it down and put it on again. He knew this was a dream. In the dream, the pale spirit would cleverly manipulate people's hearts. If he hesitated, he would be forever trapped in this foggy dream. But what about the other way around? Brando still didn't move. The Princess Griffin in front of him was just an illusion. But the feelings in his heart were sincere. If he drew his sword on her here, it would be like drawing his sword on something he had always wanted to protect in his heart. Being lost in the dream would make a person's heart confused and torn apart. Don't go, Bessie. Princess Griffin saw her sister grab Brando and hurriedly stepped forward to pull her back. Then she pulled Heureuse back a step. Two knights immediately protected them. The eldest princess raised her head and looked coldly at Brando. Caldel, you know who you are. You once swore to me that you would abandon everything in the past. You should be well aware of your uncle's actions. I didn't even ask you to be his enemy, I only asked that you protect Bessadine's safety as her fiancé. But you have disappointed me too much. She took out a letter and said in a cold voice, your true face has been exposed long ago. Sister, it's not like that. Heureuse wanted to explain but Brando's cold glare stopped him. The little prince still didn't realize this. In this dream, they were Caldel and Bessie. Not Brando and Heureuse. As soon as the eldest princess finished speaking, Brando suddenly heard a loud boom from above the palace. Then the entire hall shook. The ostentatious walls and pseudo-Doric columns shook as if a terrible earthquake was happening. The nobles in the hall lost their footing. Screams filled the air. The scene became chaotic. The crowd tried to escape through the various exits. Tables and chairs were knocked over and windows shattered. However, the tranquil corner of the hall was in stark contrast to it. Brando, Heureuse, the princess, and the knight didn't seem to be affected by the shaking ground at all. Brando looked at the nobles who fell out of the broken windows. He knew that this wasn't an earthquake that Caldel had experienced. It was his heart shaking. The cause of all this was probably the letter in Princess Griffin's hand. Viscount Caldel must have experienced this and had a deep impression of it. The princess's words were like a sharp sword that stabbed into his heart. Brando was silent. As expected, the voice in his heart screamed, "Quick, kill everyone." But Brando's hand was on the hilt of his sword. He didn't pay attention to him. At this moment, another scream sounded outside the palace. He turned back and saw that the crowd that had just surged out was now flowing back. Countless soldiers in red and white battle robes appeared outside the Quinten Palace. These soldiers were fully armored and their faces were covered by metal masks. They held sharp swords and killed anyone they saw. In the blink of an eye, the Quinten Palace was covered in rivers of blood. How can this be? The young prince stood behind Princess Griffin and saw this scene. His face was pale with fright. He couldn't help but cry out, "Who are they?" "It's Duke Erec." Princess Griffin took in a soft breath. She raised her head and stared at Brando. "Capture Viscount Caldel before Duke Erec arrives." How could these soldiers be Duke Erec's men? No matter if it was in his previous life or now, the nobles under Erec's command would never wear red and white battle robes. Besides, in Brando's memory, none of this had happened at the banquet that day. The smell of blood that had always lingered around his nose seemed to become reality because of this scene. It became even more pungent, and the smell of burning gradually took over his sense of smell. Brando raised his head and saw that flames were indeed burning from the ceiling. It seemed that in an instant, the entire hall had become a sea of fire. This was Viscount Caldel's dream. Everything that had happened in the dream that day had now been repaired by him and Heruse bit by bit and reappeared in their dream. Beside Princess Griffine, 2 knights were lunging at him. Heruse rushed over and tried to stop one of them, but the little princess lifted her skirt and almost tripped over herself. Brando pulled out the Halran Gaia. The black longsword left its scabbard like a ray of black light. But he felt that the sword was much heavier than usual. This was because his power was less than 10% of his usual level. He was almost at the upper silver level. Fortunately, Brando had expected this. The power in the dream was determined by the owner of the dream. In other words, he was now representing the Viscount Caldel of the past. But the power of an upper silver level was too weak in the year of the Wind Elves' glorious return. The 2 knights lunging at him were both at the middle gold level. No wonder Princess Griffine dared to not hide her cold gaze. In any era, the gap between the peak of the silver level and the middle gold level could not be crossed. Of course, this excluded some of the geniuses among geniuses. Brando was no genius, but the wisdom and experience he had were the accumulation of thousands of people. For example, his swordsmanship. Although he could only fight with Viscount Caldel's power, this did not mean that he had lost all his advantages. As soon as the 2 knights approached, before they could draw their swords, Brando's sword was already 1 step ahead of them. The black steel blade cut through the air. The side reflecting the light of the fire flashed with cold light. In an instant, it had cut into the 2 men's vision. The 2 knights looked shocked. They didn't even see how Brando had drawn his sword. Before the Second Holy War, the knight swordsmanship of the Wind Elves emphasized both attack and defense. This was because most of the subordinates of the Dark Dragon were magical creatures created from dark magic. Exchanging their lives with these cheap cannon fodder was obviously not worth it. Besides, the war back then was far less cruel and barbaric than it was later. So Brando's swordsmanship seemed crazy to them. But this crazy guy's swordsmanship was clearly far above theirs. The 2 knights had no choice but to take a step back. But Brando had already grasped the opportunity. He followed closely and swept away the elven longsword in one of the knight's hands. With a crisp clang, the upper half of the sword broke and flew out, stabbing into a table. The knight had never seen such barbaric behavior. Wearing heavy armor, he kept retreating. Brando chased after him until another knight took the opportunity to stab at him from behind. But Brando didn't even turn around. The snow-silver elven longsword pierced through his body as if it had stabbed an illusion. That illusion didn't stop at all. Instead, it turned and swept its sword across. With a clang, the elven knight's helmet flew high into the air. Below it was an elf's face that Brando was very unfamiliar with. But Viscount Caldel must have had a deep impression of it. 9 luminary sword art. Princess Griffine was slightly shocked. Caldel, when did you? Princess Griffine definitely wouldn't recognize 9 luminary sword art. Brando thought for a moment and understood that this was Caldel's memory at work. This wasn't the eldest princess's shock, but that guy's. By now, he had already broken through the defenses of the 2 knights and reached the eldest princess's side in 1 step. Then he grabbed her wrist. The eldest princess struggled slightly but couldn't break free. She looked up and bit her lip as she stared at him coldly. Her silver eyes were about to spit fire. Caldel, kill me now if you can. If I kill you, Duke Erek will forever bear the crime of regicide and treason, right? Brando glanced at her. In that instant, he seemed to understand many things. Princess Griffine almost trembled. She looked up at him. Enrich is a member of All for One. Your Highness, your plan is exactly what he wants. He doesn't actually care about the throne. He just wants to overthrow this kingdom, Brando answered softly. He glanced at Bessidine. You think they're still your sister, right? Her Royal Highness also glanced at Bessidine beside her. Her silver eyes were filled with complex emotions, but her tone had already softened. Kill me and let Bessidine go. She truly likes you, no. Brando heard that voice wailing in his mind again. She's lying to you. She's in cahoots with her despicable sister. This pitiful girl. Brando's heart sank. He glanced at the eldest princess. For a moment, he saw weakness in her expression, but she quickly recovered her calm. Then he looked at Rose and took in the sight of the soldiers in red and white robes who were pouring into the hall. He had never experienced this scene before, but it was very similar to what he remembered. The nobles had all died long ago. He just didn't know where Senior and the others were. Even though he knew this was a dream, Brando was still worried. Teacher, what are you talking about? Rose didn't understand. Brando smiled at him but didn't answer. But in that moment, he already had a plan. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 747. The hall had turned into an azure field covered in crimson, glaring bloodstains. The soldiers in red and white battle robes slowly walked past the corpses that were piled on top of each other. They walked past the streams of blood that had gathered into a trickle below. Their cold iron boots stepped neatly on the sticky carpet that was paved with blood as they surrounded the corner where Brendel was. The half-fairy princess was still trying to free her wrist from Brando's iron grip. She struggled but to no avail. She quickly calmed down and asked coldly, Viscount Caldel, what are you trying to do? Under Rose's panicked gaze, Brando placed the obsidian-like blade of Halran Gaia against Griffin's neck. He watched as the two approaching knights stopped and then answered, Of course I'm trying to break out of the encirclement. Break out of the encirclement. Princess Griffin glanced at the soldiers suspiciously. In her mind, these people were jackals of the same tribe as Viscount Caldel. Brando didn't explain much. He used his sword to silence the princess's knight and the female officer beside her. Then he said, If you don't want your eldest princess to be hurt, then do as I say. You come with me. We'll retreat towards the stairs and go to the second floor. Princess Griffin didn't know what Viscount Caldel was trying to do, so she huffed softly. Your Highness, if Bessidine still has a chance to live, that's what you want too, right? So I hope you can cooperate with me. I believe you're smart enough and calm enough to judge the pros and cons of the situation. Letting all of us die here has no benefit other than to your enemies, teacher. Rose looked at him with some difficulty, but the latter glared at him. The eldest princess's expression showed that she didn't believe that Caldel would suddenly change sides. She would rather believe that there was a conspiracy behind this. However, Brando was right about one thing. Ever since Princess Griffin left the Kinten Palace for the first time at the age of 16, she had always had the qualities of an outstanding politician. She could calmly analyze the situation and accept as long as it was not the worst choice. Her personal feelings had always been a luxury that she could not attain. Sometimes, her rationality was like a precise machine. She was stubborn and indifferent to herself, but at the same time, she held on to the hope in her heart. She had sacrificed everything she had, and that was how she became the Princess Royal, who was pitied and resonated with all Erewhon players in history. Therefore, she didn't reject Brando's suggestion, but she didn't agree either. That was enough. Brando knew that Princess Griffin had not given up her vigilance against him, but he also knew that she would not deliberately go against him. Next, he needed to kill his way out. He didn't want to have someone behind him who was always ready to trip him up. he immediately brought Princess Griffin towards the stairs. As expected, the eldest princess didn't resist. However, when she saw the two battered knights protecting Bessidine, she sighed in relief. For the eldest princess, as long as Bessidine could leave this place, then everything else didn't matter. In her plan, Enrich would become the greatest threat to the nobles because he had lost the royal family. This threat would evolve into a confrontation over time, and then the curtains of war would be drawn. However, the Lord of the Highlands was not as weak and easily bullied as the royal family of Covardo. The war between the nobles would definitely end in mutual destruction and compromise. The restless Madara would definitely not give up this precious opportunity. The army of the undead would sweep across the scorched earth. After that, Cruz's people would definitely not want to face the army of the Emperor with the Mercury Staff. Thus, supporting the resistance forces in Erewhon was the inevitable choice. As long as Bessidine was still alive, there was still hope for the kingdom to be reborn from the scorched earth. Although her ancient homeland would inevitably fall into a sea of fire, she couldn't care so much. She could only see the burning flames in her eyes. Whether it was her, Grand Duke Enrich, or those greedy nobles, they would all drag the kingdom into the abyss. She could only choose the better outcome. Griffin quietly felt the coldness of the blade on her neck. She calmly lowered her eyelids, but her heart was mournful. She looked back on her life, as if she was always making choices that weren't the worst. Every time she compromised, it was as if she was laying the groundwork for the next failure. For a moment, she suddenly wanted to go back to the past, back to that year. She was only 16 years old. Perhaps she should have chosen a different path, and the kingdom's future wouldn't be like this. Brando seemed to be able to vaguely feel the thoughts of the princess he was holding hostage, because this was a part of his memory. Perhaps he had the same desire in his heart. It was this desire that made him willfully change the path of decline that originally belonged to Erewhon. It was also because of the same desire that he firmly believed that he could leave this dream, and he already had his own answer in his heart. He controlled the princess with one hand, and with a sweep of the sword in his right hand, he swept away the swords in the hands of the swarming soldiers. Then he swung his sword without any fancy moves, and the ordinary blade drew a straight line in the air. The blade flashed across, and those soldiers didn't have time to withdraw their weapons to block it. They could only watch as the obsidian-like blade cut through the battle robes, the metal rings on the chainmail below, and the flesh and bones below. With a crisp sound, eye-catching rose-colored blood splashed out along with the countless broken metal rings. The color of the blood was like red wine, but darker. With just one sword, 7 or 8 soldiers flew out. They fell into the crowd and knocked away more people. Brando stood at the top of the stairs, but he didn't rush up first. Instead, he dragged Rose up and waited for the 2 knights and the female officer to rush over before he turned to cover everyone and continued forward. Princess Griffin seemed to come back to her senses. She looked at the scene in surprise. "What on earth do you want, Viscount Caldell?" This was the second time she had asked this question in a short period of time, but her tone was completely different. Even if she still had her doubts, at least she believed that Viscount Caldell and Enrich weren't working together. "I told you." Brando stood at the top of the stairs and cut down a soldier with his sword. The blade cut into the man's helmet like cutting through tofu. Blood gushed out like a waterfall from the metal cracks. He pulled out his sword and kicked the body down. Then he walked up a few steps and answered, "I just fought my way out of the encirclement." "But you and Enrich?" The eldest princess frowned. Brando actually understood the suspicion in her eyes. What she meant was, "I don't think you would betray Enrich for Bessidine. Some people would risk their lives for love, but Viscount Caldell wasn't one of them." Because he was Viscount Caldell now. Brando had to accept this, even though the difference in status and experience made it hard for him to say. He knew that his choice could cause him to fall into the dream forever, but he still did it. At this moment, he really wanted to laugh bitterly. Your brother is indeed very charming when he dresses up as a young girl, but he's still a man. But Brando had a vague idea of another possibility. This possibility made him lead the princess and the others to the second floor without hesitation. He was familiar with Kinten Palace. The second floor of the hall led to the manor in the back. There was a secret passage that led to the forest outside. That forest, if he guessed correctly, should be the forest where Viscount Caldell had been assassinated. It was also the forest where they had found the horse carriage. Even though the location didn't match at all, the dream was just that strange. So the result of the entire dream should appear there. As for life or death, Brando didn't care that much anymore. Sometimes, when faced with the confusion in your heart, you had to take a gamble. And his confusion, Viscount Caldell's confusion, and Harus's confusion had long been tangled together. Brando still didn't have a clear answer in his heart. No matter what, he would see the result if he went down. Knight kicked open the tightly shut wooden door on the second floor with a bang. The quality of the door made of black wood was surprisingly good. Even after being kicked open by 2 gold ranks, it still maintained its original appearance. Brando sent the young prince in, then the Knight and the older female official protecting him. Brando hesitated and finally decided not to hold Princess Griffin hostage. He let go of the eldest princess of Erewhon and let her walk in on her own. Princess Griffin started slightly and looked up at him in disbelief. Viscount Caldell. If you have something to say, say it later. Brando turned around. He raised his right hand and used the Wind Empress ring on his index finger to aim at the stairs in the hall where the soldiers were swarming up. Then he opened his mouth and said, "OSS." A burst of wind shot out from the ring and hit the curved staircase. The wooden planks that made up the staircase first caved in, and then the entire staircase broke down from the middle. A huge hole was blasted open, and the wooden planks slowly turned into wood shavings that fluttered down. But at the same time, it seemed like there was a rain of blood in the hall. Brando and the princess, who were still standing at the door, had a lot of blood on their faces. The princess looked at Brando, whose face was covered in blood, and asked, "Viscount Caldell, are you really willing to give up everything for Bessadine?" No, anything else was possible, but Brando's vow had nothing to do with that. He turned around and saw Harus, whose face was red to the tips of his ears because of his sister's words. He sighed and answered, "Your Highness, I don't think now is the time to express my determination. If possible, of course I will help you take care of Her Highness, but our first priority is to leave this place." But Princess Griffin looked at him and shook her head. "You don't understand. I'm already a dead knot. If I don't die, the conflict between the nobles and Erech will never rise to the surface. This kingdom will only decline day by day until it falls into the abyss of fire. I tied this knot and I will untie it. I'm only worried about whether Bessadine can distinguish the people around her. I hope you can give me a clear answer, Viscount Caldell." Brando stopped. There was a rumor in history that Princess Griffin had secretly contacted the Wind Elves to counter Erech. She had the Elven diplomatic corps bring a secret letter, but the news was leaked in the end and aroused the murderous intent of the powerful Grand Duke. Not long after that, at this banquet tonight, he ordered an assassin to kill Her Highness the Princess and frame Madara. But after the event, no one could find any relevant evidence, except for that blank letter. Her Highness the Princess had the diplomatic corps bring a blank letter. Some people suspected that it was Cruz's people who framed her, and in fact, later on, some people did find out that Cruz's people were behind the assassination. Even the Holy Cathedral of Fire couldn't escape being involved. But Brando suddenly guessed another truth. That blank letter that the Wind Elven diplomatic corps brought back to the Elven court was just a plan for you to force Erech to act, right, Your Highness? Princess Griffin looked at him with some surprise. "How did you know?" Erech already knew. No, if he knew, he wouldn't have chosen to do it. Brando didn't say a word. A wreck had been set up. In the end, the princess regent used her own life to set a trap for the old fox. Everything that happened after that was just as she thought. Erwin's civil war, the Third War of the Black Roses, Heroes and Alara's marriage, and the establishment of the Erwin resistance. But he didn't feel relaxed at all. Instead, he felt angry. Her Highness the Princess not only set up a wreck, but also deceived all the players who supported her. He would never forget the night when the city of Mengsteros fell into a sea of fire. He also couldn't forget the lonely look on his senior sister's face when she left. He stared at the princess, unable to confirm whether what she said was true or false, because this was actually his own memory. But Brando calmly suppressed the unhappiness in his heart, because the negative emotions in the dream were confusion, and the pale spirits lurking in the dark manipulated people's hearts in order to make people lose control of their emotions. No one knew this more deeply than Brando. He asked this to test Viscount Caldel's feelings, just as he knew that Caldel must have experienced the same things in the same dream as he did. In other words, the Lord Viscount must have had the same confusion in his heart as he did. The information on the strategy was useless now. Brando tossed it aside. Not having a strategy didn't mean he couldn't move forward. First, he was also an excellent player, and second, he had stronger feelings. If he couldn't defend, then he would have to attack. First, he had to answer a question of his own. How did Viscount Caldel answer his confusion back then? And how would he answer? Brando was silent for a moment, then answered Princess Griffin, "Sometimes the right choice isn't necessarily the right one, Your Highness." "Then what is the right choice?" The eldest princess raised her head and looked at him in confusion. She seemed to hear the hidden meaning in the Lord Viscount's words. This question also echoed in Brando's heart. It was the question Viscount Caldel's ghost asked over and over again: what is the right choice? Brando raised his head and glanced down. The soldiers in red and white battle robes were climbing up from the dust-filled hall. He retreated into the room and pulled the princess some distance away. Then he exhaled softly, as if to confirm the thought in his heart. People can't always be willful, but willfulness can actually be forgiven. As he answered, he felt his heart move slightly. That was the emotion that belonged to Viscount Caldel. This pale ghost who had always hidden himself in the dark, this knight who had lost his name in the fog of history, finally couldn't hold himself back anymore. And as soon as he moved, Brando finally confirmed the answer to his question. He found it, the answer to the riddle. A person's dream was actually a subconscious self-suggestion. In this short period of time, Brando remembered more than once the parents he had seen at the banquet, as well as himself as a child. These memories that revealed his past haunted him like a nightmare. But until a certain moment, he suddenly realized that it wasn't the mysterious existence in the fog that was tempting him to lose his mind. On the contrary, what was hidden the deepest in people's hearts was the opportunity to save themselves. It was the same for Viscount Caldel. He recalled again and again the illusion of Brando's grandfather in the golden demonic tree. He remembered again and again the disappointment in his parents' eyes when they looked at him. Although he was drenched in cold sweat, he finally realized something. This disappointment didn't come from his failure. Willfulness could actually be forgiven. But avoidance and self-fear couldn't. He even lost the courage to challenge his failure again. He was like a weak person who gripped his sword tightly with both hands but didn't dare to take a step forward and pierce through the illusion in front of him. He was the person who couldn't hold his sword. That person had also been Viscount Caldel. And Heroes. He could stab Princess Griffin to death with one blow. That might have been Viscount Caldel's wish. But Brando finally realized that it definitely wasn't his own. If he chose this, if he chose to compromise in the middle. Just like how once a person lost their courage, they lost the determination to break through the illusion. A person who lost the determination to break through the illusion could only stay in the dream forever. In this moment, Brando was truly certain of this, just like how he felt the throbbing of Viscount Caldell's feelings in his heart. He could completely understand that feeling. It was fear and dread, confusion and jealousy. Because he had made the exact opposite choice. Caldell chose to compromise. Thus, he remained in his own incomplete dream. But Brando's choice was to willfully change all of this. He willfully chased after his own heart and willfully fulfilled his ideals and beliefs. If he gave up, he would fail. Brando seemed to see a pitiful figure flash by in front of him. He gripped his sword. The conviction in his heart had never been stronger. In front of him, the corridors suddenly collapsed layer by layer. The scenery seemed to melt and turn into thick fog. After the fog parted, the Kintan Palace seemed to collapse like gravel, disappearing with the wind along with the corpses of the soldiers and nobles. In the gravel, Brendel even saw his parents, himself when he was a child, his senior, and all the members of the Scarlet Brigade. Their faces merged into the fog, fading backward and gradually disappearing. But that last glimpse was forever imprinted in his memory. Only Princess Griffine, Herreuse, the two-knight and the older female official were left beside him. The princess seemed to be unaware of the changes around her. She grabbed Herreuse's hand and walked forward resolutely. The little prince now completely understood what his sister was thinking. Although he still didn't understand the meaning behind the sacrifice, the history of what had happened in the dream was like a heavy nightmare to him. Herreuse bit his lip. His eyes were moist but he didn't cry. Many years ago, he still remembered the stars in the summer night of Kintan Palace. At that time, his father was still alive. He remembered his sister telling him that a man shouldn't cry. But he only remembered crying because he was taught a lesson in swordsmanship training until his knees turned red. The fog parted. Behind it was a forest. The sky was full of stars. The pine trees rustled, the water gurgled, and the fire in the distance swayed gently like a dream. Brando remembered his childhood. The air was so fresh after the summer night. He took a deep breath and raised his head. Then, he saw the carriage that was quietly parked in the forest. The door was open, and a corner of a silver dress could be seen. A beautiful girl lay in the carriage with a black dagger in her chest. She was beautiful. Her pointed ears showed her identity. But she was different from Herreuse. She was a real elf. Brando didn't speak. But he already knew the other party's identity. Besidine Ramona Ueba. P.S. Today's second update, 10,000 words. I've always wanted to talk about the bottleneck I've encountered recently. Actually, it's not appropriate to call it a bottleneck. It's better to call it a misunderstanding. I've encountered this problem for more than a day or two. Starting from the second half of Canaan, I've been troubled by similar problems. Because the more I write, the more I worry about my gains and losses. I'm always afraid that I'll deviate from my original intention and the burden will become heavier. So every once in a while, I have to stop and reconsider my original intention. Even Canaan was broken because of this. After writing so many words, I still haven't found the root of the problem. Instead, I've become more and more restrained. Today, after talking to everyone, I finally understand what I'm pursuing. Sigh, after so many complaints, I just want to find my carefree self when I was writing Canaan. I've been very tired recently. I hope everyone can understand. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 748. History was quietly reflected in the starry night sky. Those dazzling new stars were said to be the heroes of the past. They looked down on the earth from the heavens, using the eyes of history to observe the world of today. The wind above the pine forest never stopped, but it wasn't strong. Instead, it gently moved the needles with an invisible hand, causing them to sway neatly and rustle softly. It was like a dream, narrating the forest's past. The edge of the world collapsed as the dream progressed. The forest seemed to be swallowed by endless fog, but only this small world was left in the void. The mountain wind blew through the forest, the meadow, the carriage, the assassinated elven girl, and Brando's group formed this still picture. Moonlight spread over the mountains. Time flowed quietly with the stars. The bright moon was like a hook, rising in the west and setting in the east. To everyone, this was the end of the dream, but it wasn't a line. Brando looked up at the entire forest. His gaze passed through the layers of tree trunks and landed on the dark carriage. He shouted, "Caldel, I know you're here. Come out and let me see your tricks." There was a moment of silence, so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. A pale figure appeared in the carriage. The figure swayed slightly like a ghost, glowing as if it was shrouded in a pale phosphorescent fire. He was dressed in neat noble clothing and had an elven longsword at his waist. However, he had no face. Only a pair of sparkling eyes remained on his flat face, like a slate. Without a mouth, they couldn't communicate. The Myrna said that language was the bridge between people, but the Nameless had long escaped into their own dreams and were forever lost. Therefore, other than using their eyes to suspect, they didn't need ears or mouths. The pale ghost appeared at the door of the carriage and silently stared at Brando. It didn't say a word, and neither did Brando. After what seemed like a long time, the ghost slowly said, "Why did you challenge me?" Even though it didn't have a mouth, its voice seemed to echo through the entire forest like thunder rolling from the horizon. Haru's little face was pale with fright, and he could not help but shrink behind his sister. But the princess and her entourage did not seem to hear him. They looked blankly in the direction of Brando's conversation, as if there was nothing there. "You should know what you have to do, and what you have to protect here is just an illusion that doesn't exist. You should return to the world that belongs to you, and not waste time here. Otherwise, you will be lost in a dreamlike dream and never wake up," Viscount Caldel said slowly. "But you came here and let me see your weak choice. You chose to stay here forever and wallow in the illusion of the past." Since he couldn't threaten him, he decided to guide him patiently. Brando sneered, drew his sword, and pointed at the pale shadow. "What is weaker than weakness? You're just an incomplete personality. Hatred and jealousy have long since obliterated your mind. In the experience of wandering in the forest for so long, paranoia has long swallowed up your humanity. How can something like you understand what salvation is?" He exhaled and showed his shiny teeth. "What you've forgotten is not only your reputation. You've forgotten something more important. It has long been lost on the long road behind you. Viscount Caldel, the beginning of everything, the source of regret, is hidden under the layers of wounds, but I will find it and show it to you. Humans learn to cry to protect their pain, and you've long forgotten that. Because you can no longer be called human." The blade of Halran Gaia, as dark as a dream, pointed straight ahead, at the pale shadow's chest. But it was also like a dividing line in the forest, separating this world from the other. Anger appeared on the ghost's face. In the next moment, a spark of fire appeared in the depths of Haru's silver eyes. The fire burned from the carriage behind Viscount Caldel. The fire spread behind Viscount Caldel, turning the forest into a sea of fire in the blink of an eye. Viscount Caldel's eyes sparkled. He waved his hand coldly and let out a shrill voice. "Fine, I'll see how long you can be stubborn for. In your heart, the so-called persistence is nothing more than weakness. The human heart is illusory." The pale ghost reached out his left hand. His fingers had become sharp claws. A crack suddenly split open on his featureless face. It was like a mouth that was silently mocking everyone. Then the sea of fire enveloped the entire forest. In the light of the fire, a thick fog rose. the scenery around them changed again. Brando could still feel the burning flames beside him. But when he looked around, the pine forest was long gone. What appeared in his field of vision was a straight corridor. On one side of the corridor was a large arched window. Outside the arched window, the manor and palace rose and fell, extending into the brilliant lights in the distance. But this bright pearl that sat on the plains was now covered in dust. The entire city was burning fiercely. Flames rose everywhere. Brando and the little prince beside him saw the fire spread along the palace, burning all the way to their feet. Everywhere they looked was a sea of fire. The glass of the arched window shattered under the high temperature. Then, countless skeleton soldiers poured in from the outside. These skeletons wobbled and raised their nether steel longswords. The phosphorescence in their eyes was either bright or dark as they surrounded the area. On the pitch-black longswords, the Roman rose in full bloom was so dazzling. It was like a sharp thorn, piercing Brando's pupils until they contracted. It was such a familiar scene. The spirits of the dead appeared in the sea of fire. The palace burned, the city collapsed. The army of the dead swept across their homeland. Everywhere they passed, only scorched earth was left. Erwin's glorious flag finally turned to ash that night. That was the last night on the battlefield. The sad song in the hearts of Erwin players reappeared in his memory. The last battle in Monstrelos, Viscount Caldel's sharp laughter echoed in the air. But there was jealousy in it. You think it's so easy to make a choice. But reality will always force you. You will face a desperate situation. Life or death. You must choose one of the two. What are mortals in front of the power of fate? But Brando ignored him. He felt his own power. It was still only at the peak of the silver level. He immediately turned his head and said to Huruz beside him, "Take your sister and retreat into Kinten Palace. Find a way to get to White Rose Castle. You should know that there is a secret passage there that leads to the underground river." "But what about you, teacher?" Huruz's hand was held tightly by Princess Griffin. He couldn't help but look up and ask worriedly. "Of course I'm retreating with you. What are you thinking?" Brando replied irritably. "But I have to deal with these skeletons. You can't expect me to keep holding your sister's hand, can you?" Princess Griffin started slightly. Only then did she notice that Brando had been holding her wrist. She blushed and struggled to free her hand. "I know that secret passage. It's under the bed in the room where the queen stayed." "Come with me," she replied, pretending to be calm. Huruz stuck out his tongue and hurriedly covered his sister as they retreated into the corridor behind Brando. Even though the skeletons were slow, they were still closing in on him. He knew that there would be no end to fighting with these low-level undead creatures. He raised his head and looked at the structure of the corridor. He raised his sword and swung it twice, cutting down a row of pillars on both sides of the corridor. The corridor that lost its support collapsed with a loud bang, crushing the wobbling undead underneath. There were still 2 or 3 that escaped. Brando kicked them back into the ruins, then put away his sword, turned around, and ran. Kinten Palace had been completely engulfed in flames, but at least it was similar to what happened in his memory. The corridor leading to the inner court was built with a large number of stone buildings, so it was well preserved in the sea of fire. They passed through this road to White Rose Castle. It didn't take long for the outline of the cruise-style castle to appear in the night. White Rose Castle was built before the year of the Golden Hoof. Its earliest owners were actually the cruise people, but after coming over, it was assigned to the former king and his subjects along with this land. After the Year of Revelation, the castle was destroyed in a fire and was later rebuilt together with Kinten Palace. What Brando saw now was this rebuilt castle. This castle was the last stronghold of the Monsteros Palace. It was also the last stronghold to fall during the Third War of the Black Rose. The castle's drawbridge must have been pulled up. Now we can only go through the back door from the kitchen, Her Highness reminded him as she ran. Brando nodded. This was similar to what he had expected. There was no way to go through the kitchen, but there was a passage to transport food. As long as they entered the inner city, there would be a way to escape Kinten Palace. But as for where to go after leaving the inner city, he didn't think too much about it. Now was the time to put everything on the line. They had just rushed into the small forest in the courtyard in front of the castle when suddenly a group of knights in black clothes and black armor appeared in front of them. Brando saw the knights in full armor with green phosphorescence under their steel masks and couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Black Knight. He almost groaned inwardly. In this era, these should be the elite knight in Madara's army of the dead. If he still had his original strength, it would be easy to deal with them. But now, to break through their defense line would undoubtedly be a battle to the death. Because of Viscount Caldel's control, the Black Knight also discovered the princess's group almost immediately. They turned their undead warhorses around and charged in their direction, raising the pitch-black long swords in their hands as they charged forward. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 749. The Black Knight galloped through the forest like a black storm but was eerily silent. The skeletal warhorses' hooves landed on the meadow as if they were floating in the air. All that was left was the green soulfire that floated up and down with their bodies. Brando stared at the blades in their hands. You can't escape. Brando heard Viscount Caldel's duck-like voice scream hysterically. You know what choice you should make. You're a smart person. Are you going to abandon everything in reality? The people you love and the people who love you, just to stay in this illusory dream? I know you understand what reality is. You're a strong person, not a weak person. You have to learn to choose. You're not a willful boy anymore. You understand your responsibility. Shut up. Losers don't have the right to talk to me about responsibility. Brando's figure flashed. The activation of the charge skill made him crash into a Black Knight like a rhinoceros. The Black Knight didn't react at all to the fact that these weak humans dared to attack. The soul fire in his eyes burned fiercely, but it was useless. Brando had already pressed a hand on his iron mask and dragged him off his warhorse. With a loud crash, the Black Knight was pulled off his horse and fell to the ground. Brando landed behind them in a flash. The Black Knight was shocked. They turned their mounts around again and surrounded Brando. Brando raised his head to observe the situation. He saw with some pity that the Black Knight who fell off his horse adjusted his helmet and got up again. The strength of a peak silver was still too weak. He had only caught the knight off guard. If he still had the strength of an elemental level, he would have flattened the Black Knight into a thin piece of metal. Brando immediately raised Halran Gaia and shouted to Haruz, who was not far away, Haruz, take your sister away. You know where to go. Haruz was stunned for a moment. He looked at Brando in a daze and shook his head desperately. Sir, what about you? I'll be there soon, Brando replied confidently. But, cut the crap. This is an order. Get lost. Brando roared. The little prince trembled in fear, but before he could say anything, Her Highness grabbed his hand. Princess Griffine looked in the direction of Brando and ordered the knight beside her, go help him, make sure he survives. The two knights beside her immediately nodded, drew their swords, and rushed over. Brendel glanced at the two knights and shook his head. He could not count on them. He raised his hand and gestured to the Black Knight, shouting, idiots, let me see if your Emperor's Mercury staff is really that powerful. The high-grade undead also had intelligence, and naturally, they could not accept these humans insulting their Supreme Emperor. The Black Knight's eyes lit up slightly, and they immediately charged at Brando. Brando saw that he had succeeded in seducing them and immediately turned to run. What a joke! Although he said it with confidence, he was not crazy enough to challenge 7 or 8 Black Knight with the strength of a silver peak. He rushed to the woods in the courtyard because he remembered that there was a path to the main hall, where he might be able to get rid of these terrible creatures. The premise was that he could enter the forest. Princess Griffin pulled her sister all the way forward. Heruz held his skirt with one hand and looked back from time to time worriedly in the direction Brando left. He still remembered that this was a dream. Since his teacher brought him here, the two of them should leave together. How could he leave him alone? He thought with some panic in his heart. It was at this time that Princess Griffin suddenly stopped. The elder princess frowned and looked at the kitchen not far away that led to the side door of the castle. But unlike in her memory, the kitchen door was closed. She was stunned for a moment. Then, she pulled out a dagger from under her skirt and slashed the lock twice. Unfortunately, the magic lock in the palace could not be opened by brute force. Other than leaving 2 shallow scratches, her efforts were in vain. "Sister, let me try." Only then did Heruz notice his sister's actions. He glanced at the door, lifted his skirt with both hands, and then slammed into the wooden door. However, the little prince would never have dreamed that the moment before he crashed into the door would open by itself with a creak. He crashed into nothing and almost flew straight into the house. Fortunately, a pair of hands reached out from behind the door and held him firmly. He looked up and saw a familiar face. No. By Allium Japonicum. Heruz was slightly startled and thought for a while before he remembered the name of the female wizard he saw outside the Kintan Palace. But Allium Japonicum put a finger to her lips, made a silent gesture, and said with a straight face, "Take the princess and hide here. Wait for me here." Heruz froze for a moment and looked at her in disbelief. "No, you are Sister Maynard." Maynard glanced at him, shook her head at him, then pulled out her sword and rushed out of the door. Heruz was left standing by the door in a daze, watching the female knight's back disappear into the night. Brando had just staged a victorious escape. Unfortunately, the good times did not last long. He had finally shaken off the Black Knight, but the script did not play out as he had imagined. He had just entered the corridor leading to the side hall when he bumped into a set of armor that made a clanking sound as it walked. Yes, it was a set of armor. It was completely black, like the plain style from the era of the War of the Holy Saints. But there was no wearer inside the armor. Instead, a ball of blue flame burned. The cursed armor was actually a ghost, a type of undead. This kind of terrifying undead had only appeared on the battlefield during the Second War of the Black Rose, and it was only natural that they would appear in this dream. It was more powerful than the Black Knight, and was not at all restricted in the narrow terrain. In reality, it was more agile than Brando had imagined. He didn't know if it was Viscount Caldel's doing, but Brando saw that thing scurrying back and forth on the ceiling, almost a hair faster than him. And when he looked up again, he realized with some despair that there was a tightly sealed dead end in front of him. "Do you know?" As if sensing Brendel's predicament, Caldel's voice carried a hint of mockery. He spoke frankly in Brendel's mind, sometimes, hard work doesn't guarantee success. All you get is endless frustration. People like you always think that problems can be easily solved. How can you use a simple choice to deny other people's hard work? I tried before, but all I got was failure. And you, too, Caldel, Brando answered. The sound of the cursed armor running behind them was getting closer and closer. He could almost smell the unique rancid smell of soul essence. This has nothing to do with success or failure, then what does it have to do with? Your power can't change anything. No, there is something I have that you don't. What is that? Viscount Caldel paused slightly. It was as if the entire world had stopped with his thoughts. Brando looked up. He was less than 10 meters away from the door. Courage. Brando raised Halran Gaia and slammed it against the wooden door. With a loud crash, the wooden door instantly shattered into pieces. Brando rolled into the room behind him. His arms were pierced by countless wooden splinters and he gritted his teeth in pain. And Brando saw a hand appear in front of him. He stilled slightly, somewhat surprised, but also understood. He reached out to take the hand. The power that responded to him was so familiar. They had fought side by side thousands of times and condensed into one word. Companions. Brando looked up and saw the face that was gradually becoming clearer. The girl smiled sweetly, showing her white teeth. She carried a large sword and looked at him somewhat mockingly. You're quite late, Sophie. Black tea. You came from the direction of Kinten Palace, right? Why are you so late? There are too many undead. Brando almost blurted out. This conversation was too familiar, almost exactly the same as in his memory. He closed his eyes and almost felt like he was going to cry. When he opened his eyes again, he saw one figure after another appear behind Black Tea. Wizards, warriors, nightingales, the faces of the players. Every one of them was so familiar. They smiled at him. It was the consolation between comrades. I thought so too. Everyone is heading to the side hall to prepare to defend against the last wave of attack from the undead. All the members of the Scarlet Travelers, Lighter's exploration team, everyone is here. We're in charge of holding the rear here. Sophie, your senior sister is waiting for you in the palace. Hearing these familiar words, Brando felt as if everything had returned to that war. He saw one figure after another appear behind Black Tea. Wizards, warriors, nightingales, the faces of the players. Every one of them was so familiar. They smiled at him. It was the consolation between comrades. Leave this to us, keep going, Sophie. Brando stopped. He could feel Viscount Caldel's feelings trembling in his heart. He knew what he was afraid of. He walked past Black Tea, past everyone else and walked forward. Everyone opened a path for Brando. After this battle, there will be no more Erwin. But at least we have to let his sword shine one last time, someone shouted. For Erwin, the players raised their swords and answered in unison. Brando walked past each of them until a voice rang out. Sophie. Brando paused slightly. He turned his head. Everything behind him seemed to disappear. Only the scene of the players fighting was left. Black Tea looked at him and raised her sword. Forget us, Sophie, no. She suddenly stopped and changed her words. Brando. Brando was silent. He knew these were his feelings. Why? Because you have to walk further forward. If you keep looking back, you will slow down. This time, Brando didn't answer. He turned his head. The corridor in front of him seemed to stretch endlessly. He didn't answer Black Tea's question because it was like he was asking himself a question. He already had an answer in his heart. This is your answer. Viscount Caldel's voice shouted angrily in Brando's heart. Stubborn. You know you chose the wrong path. You think you're defying fate. You're just running away from reality. Brando walked forward and answered in his heart, Viscount Caldel, everyone has experienced failure. But only courage and trust are things you will never understand. Because you gave up on them from the beginning. No. Viscount Caldel screamed. Its figure seemed to materialize in front of Brendel, and the white specter instantly grew to a gigantic size. Its lower body was shattered, and its upper body was shackled. It had no mouth, and only a pair of cold glinting eyes could be seen. You can't save him. You can't save yourself. You can't save anyone. The monster that Viscount Caldel's spirit had transformed into howled and swiped at Brando with its claws. But Brando seemed to have expected it. He stepped back and the 5 sharp, long claws brushed past his chest. He immediately felt his strength return to his body, giving him the power of an elemental level again. He raised his head and looked at the enormous Viscount Caldel's spirit in front of him. He knew that he had grasped the key to the entire mission. The terrifying monster in front of him was the amalgamation of the negative emotions in Viscount Caldel's heart. According to the strategy guide, it was the final boss in this dream. Compared to the dream itself, this so-called monster was actually the easiest part to deal with. It was merely an elite at the peak of the gold level. Brendel was even able to raise his head and stare at the deformed monster. He sneered, "Is this the jealousy and regret that you've imprisoned in your heart? You've been running away from yourself for so long, and you've only created a weak monster. You can't stop me because no one can stop the determination in a person's heart." As soon as he finished speaking, he had already disappeared. What was left in Caldel's distorted vision was a cold blade. It was so fast that it was even faster than the lightning of thought. The monster only had time to raise its head and then this movement froze in place. In the end, it turned into a long howl of anguish. Then with a loud clang, Viscount Caldel's distorted spirit seemed to vanish into thin air. The shackles on his body all fell to the ground. Brando put away his long sword. He turned his head to look and saw a silver item shining in the shackles. That should be the reward from this mission. Brando reached out his hand in that direction and the item immediately entered his dimension hole. He didn't have time to examine it closely because the entire dream had begun to shake violently following Viscount Caldel's death. The world of this dream was about to collapse. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 750. The world of dreams was collapsing layer by layer, but Brando knew there was still one last stretch of road to walk. He put away his things and turned off the experience notifications. He looked up and saw a long corridor appear in front of him. This deep walkway seemed to extend forward in a ring-shaped space, and the surrounding fog was filled with flickering fragments of the past. He knew that this was no longer Viscount Caldel's dream, but a dream that truly belonged to him. Self-redemption was often the opportunity hidden in the deepest part of a person's heart. Brando walked forward slowly. He passed through the darkness and then light came from all directions, spilling over him. Finally, he saw a door. That door was immersed in darkness and silence. The pattern on the door was a bronze key and a silver crescent moon. This memory was as fresh as yesterday. Brando didn't stop. Instead, he walked forward and pushed the door open. The heavy wooden door opened with a creak. Behind the door was the center of the palace. Kinten Palace, Hall of the Wise. A dim light shone down from the dome. The hall was silent. The throne was in the center of the palace. A silver crown rested on the scarlet throne. The crown had a slender elven style. It was painted with the mountains of the south and the clouds of the north. Brando remembered that many people had worn this crown because it had once been the symbol of Erewhon. An unknown craftsman had made this laurel crown. King Eric had worn it to be crowned king at Grey Wind Stronghold. In the long years that followed, dozens of kings had sat on this honor, but they had all turned to dust. After the pages of history had been turned, it welcomed its last owner. It was a beautiful half-elven girl. Brando saw the faint silver light refracting from the crown. It was almost the same color as Princess Griffin's silver hair. But after the light faded, it seemed so dull. Did it know where its former owner was now? Had it watched the beautiful princess sleep forever in this palace? Perhaps it didn't care about the blood on it because it was a dead object to begin with. It had only been entrusted with the greed of mortals. Brando walked to the center of the hall. There was no one in the palace. He knew that there had been a time when many kings had sat here, and even Her Royal Highness the eldest princess had walked gracefully along the red carpet that led to the main hall, where the knights bowed before her. In another time period, he and his senior sister were standing together in the same dilapidated hall. The dim light and the sound of wind and fire mixed together outside, and the sounds of fighting could be heard from far and near. That was the dying heroine's final cry, as if it symbolized the groan before the palace collapsed. But now, he was the only one left. Everything was the same as before. Brando saw the flames burning in from outside the palace. In the blink of an eye, the palace had turned into a blazing hell. The pillars collapsed, and the beautiful artwork turned to dust. He stood alone in the middle of the flames. "Why aren't you afraid of failure?" a weak voice asked. It was Viscount Caldel's voice. "I'm afraid of failure." Brando saw the pale figure emerge from the flames. He picked up the crown, put it aside, and then sat on the throne. He answered, "But I'm more afraid of not being able to see my heart clearly. Death isn't scary. What's scary is losing yourself." Viscount Caldel didn't say a word. He stood silently across from Brando. After a long time, he finally sighed. Brando saw him turn and walk towards the sea of flames. His back disappeared into the flames. He heard that faint sigh. "I'm sorry, Bassadine. I'm sorry, Lord Saint Ausol." Brando closed his eyes. It was as if he had another long dream in the dream. In the dream, Viscount Caldel wasn't called Viscount Caldel. He had another identity. People called him the King of the Sun, Caldel Fred. He once had a fiancée, a woman named Bassadine Ramona Moonleaf. Only such a noble name could bear the surname of the Wind Elf royal family. But the Viscount Caldel in his memory had already died in that forest with his fiancée. Brando opened his eyes. The fire had reached the bottom of the throne, but he still hadn't woken from the dream. He sat on the throne. He didn't know if it was right or wrong, but this was indeed his choice. A loud crash came from the flames. Brando thought that a pillar on the side of the hall had collapsed. But a figure suddenly rushed out of the flames and grabbed his hand. "Come with me." Brando paused. He looked up and saw the familiar figure moving forward in the flames. Her fluttering black hair was especially dazzling in the hot air. "Senior." The figure didn't answer. She just pulled him through the sea of flames. The palace collapsed beside them. It was almost impossible to tell which direction was which in the thick smoke. The temperature seemed to be getting hotter and hotter. The rolling fog gradually covered all sight. After a moment, Brando felt that he was walking completely in the black fog. He couldn't tell if he was still in the Kinten Palace under his feet. But the fog suddenly parted to the left and right. The cold moonlight seemed to fall from above and sprinkle on him. Brando paused for a moment and raised his head. There was no longer any palace or sea of flames around him. There was only the flickering shadows of the cedar forest. Only then did he notice that the cold light from before wasn't moonlight at all. It was a light blue arc on the horizon. It was the tide of magic. The moving shadows of the clouds reflected this light on Brando's face. The female knight in front of him pulled him forward a few more steps. Then she let go and turned back. Both of them were sweating profusely. Brando looked at the female knight's pale face and paused. Then he blurted out, "Maynard." The female knight didn't answer. She turned and walked into the forest. Brando saw Herauz curled up under a tree. He was sleeping soundly with a shiny line at the corner of his mouth. This guy was actually drooling in his dreams. Brando thought of the little prince in his dreams. It was hard to imagine. Maynard didn't wake him up. Instead, she walked to His Royal Highness, took the cloak off her body, and then put it on him. Brando saw the way she took care of someone and thought of his senior sister Allium Japonicum more than once. "Are you hiding something from me, Lady Maynard?" he suddenly asked. "Don't ask, thank you." Maynard turned back and replied softly, "Just this once, give me a little time." Brando was slightly startled. He just looked at Maynard, and the two were speechless for a moment. But soon, a soft sound came from the woods. Brando turned back and saw Lorena and Philas walking out of the bushes hand in hand. The female knight from the Cruz Empire also gave Brando and Maynard a strange look when she saw them together. "Ha, Count, I didn't expect you to be faster than us." Philas was much more direct. He shouted, "I just had a weird dream. It really pissed me off." "What happened?" It wasn't beyond Brando's expectations that the lucky couple would be the first to come out of the dream, but he was curious about what could make this guy so angry. Before Lorena could stop him, Philas had already blurted out, "I dreamed that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince wanted to marry Lorena." It was wishful thinking. "So how did you solve it?" Brando saw the female knight blushing at Philas' words and knew that the dream must have been very exciting. He calmed himself down and continued to ask curiously. "Nonsense, of course I killed him," Philas replied bitterly. Brando was sweating profusely as he listened, thinking that this guy was a little too tough. The Crown Prince of the Cruz Empire, wouldn't he be the first in line to the throne? He actually killed him just like that. After all, the dream was so real that maybe Philas didn't even consider whether he was in a dream or reality when he did it. But he glanced at this guy and suddenly realized that only such a person would never be confused by the fog in his heart. "You're very lucky, Miss Lorena," Brando said. The female knight blushed slightly and punched Philas hard. "This guy doesn't think before he does things. He scared me to death." Philas chuckled, and Brando smiled as well. He felt lucky for Philas and Lorena. Not everything in this world could go according to one's wishes, but few people had the essence of perseverance in adversity. He looked up. There was no moonlight in the sky. The surging clouds had just spread over the forest, and the demonic wave had reached its most intense moment. A few hours seemed to have passed in a flash, and Freya and Scarlet walked out of the dream one after the other. Medisha, the Shire, and Hippamra themselves were no longer dreaming. They were just lost because Brando was lost, and came back not long after Brando left the dream. Then there were the scattered knight and the rest of the entourage in the team. Afterward, Maynard did a headcount and found that more than half of the team had scattered. All the missing people had been lost in the forest forever and could never be found. Thinking of this, everyone couldn't help but shudder, and had a new understanding of the horror of this forest. Brando asked Freya in private about her experience with Scarlet, and as he expected, Freya relived the nightmare of escaping from Butchie. However, she said that Brando didn't exist in her dream, which made Brando break out in a cold sweat. Freya also told him that she experienced a completely different night in Butchie. The future Valkyrie didn't go into too much detail, and just softly thanked him at the end. Brando could roughly guess what happened to her, just like how he could guess that she would return to Butchie that night. Perhaps for the Valkyrie, that was the most important memory in her life. A memory that changed her life. As for Scarlet, the Highlander girl didn't say much. She just looked at him quietly for a moment, then followed him and never left. Brando couldn't figure out what she dreamed of. But just like everyone else, everyone seemed to be especially quiet after leaving their dreams. Most of them leaned on each other and sat in the forest, as if they were recalling their dreams. The morning that could never be seen in the Evernight forest brought a new day to everyone in the sense of time. P.S. The next day at 3 p.m., your champion baboon has been resurrected. Please vote. Please vote. Please vote. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 752. Dang, dang, dang. Bells rang rapidly in the Lion Palace, and the monks of the Holy Church swarmed out, stepping barefoot on the white marble, and came to the Ironheart Square. Above the city of Leo, clouds gathered, and rolling dark clouds were pressing down from the sky. The great Mana Tide was just as Brando had expected. From the 10 cities to the shining sea, from the Mech realm of the Hazel people to the hanging cloud mountains in the far east, the surge of the Mana Tide alarmed everyone. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked up in surprise. An obscure blue was crossing the dark sky, shining like the first light of dawn, and piercing through the clouds like a curved arc, crossing half the sky and piercing the canopy overhead. The astrologers of Wonde were terrified at this moment. The sea of mana was roaring violently, and every saint who hid in the prayer room and prayed devoutly to their God could not calm the turmoil in their hearts. Dark clouds covered the light of the stars and the moon, and darkness passed over the mountains, plains, shining lakes, and rolling forests. From west to east, the pillars of order in every holy church on the vast land of Wonde lit up one by one. Martha's Law of Tiamat issued a warning to everyone, heralding the coming of an era of chaos. On the Ironheart Square, the lofty bishops looked up at the dramatic changes in the sky with an indescribable expression on their faces. Some people were whispering, but more people had begun to turn around. Go to the Sublime Hall, ignite the crystal of order, and send an announcement to the other holy churches. The loud voice passed through the square, and the first drizzle drifted down from the sky. In the blink of an eye, the temperature had dropped sharply. Everyone turned back, and behind them, the bells in the city were ringing. And across the sea, the bugas floated in the sky, and dozens of cities were flying slowly above the clouds. In the darkness, lightning occasionally illuminated the silver spires of the towers. In Onais, the astrologers walked out of their white tower one by one. Those archmages in white robes and holding long scrolls, even if they could not see, could still feel the changes in the world's order. The huge magic circle of Tiamat was changing its orbit. The entire world rumbled. In the distant heavenly realm, in the depths of the sea of clouds, lightning would occasionally fall, like a winding flame that lit up the pitch-black sea. The pale electric light passed through the attic window with a strong foreign style, casting the shadow of the craftsmanship patterns on his thin and long cheeks. William held the wizard's chess piece and seemed to be in deep thought. His face was pale. He sat upon the throne of the 12 protector kings, the throne behind him like an elongated shadow. The pointed back of the throne, which symbolized supreme knowledge, extended infinitely toward the vault in this environment, brimming with mysterious majesty. The old mage remained motionless like a statue. His deep gaze was fixated on the arched hall that towered like the vault of heaven below the handrail. The depths of his eyes were like the restless sea of magic at this moment, containing an endless fog. The great wizards in silver robes passed through the empty corridor one after another. They passed through the heavy curtains hanging from the arched beams, passed through the hall, and came under the gaze of 320 pairs of eyes. They raised their heads. Above them, the members of the Silver Union were no longer sleepy like they usually were. Instead, they were all frowning. There were no whispers, no whispers. The air was filled with an ominous aura. Citizens of Buga, great wizards, salute knowledge, salute the truth. A voice reverberated in the hall, echoing repeatedly, but then roaring angrily. A wizard in a white robe held a parchment scroll in his hand. He raised his head like a lion and questioned everyone. Today, who foresaw all of this and concealed the truth? We demand an answer. Is this the sign of destruction and new life in the prophecy, or is it the sea of magic showing its anger once every few decades? The borders of Tiamat have long been unable to suppress the rising and violent power. The archivists and the Silver Candle Association have sensed the arrival of a great change from every subtle sign on the 1,400 nodes. But what about our Senate? The senators are still sleepy. Where is the eye of the revelator? Where are the scepters of the 10th realm? The wizard waved his fist powerfully, like a challenge. Since the War of the Holy Saints, the reaction of the Bugis of the Silver Folk has been slow day after day, like those arrogant reptiles. This alliance is aging, and only a new spirit can reinvigorate it. Change is coming. Are we going to miss the opportunity again? The Silver Elves have appeared, and according to that ancient language, we should also ask for self-cleansing and reformation. I plead, initiate arbitration. More voices shouted, and the hall buzzed for a moment. The distorted face seemed to be deformed by excessive anger. The silver-haired, kind-looking old man withdrew his gaze from the overly exaggerated face below. He glanced at the members who were looking at each other and could not help but throw the queen in his hand onto the chessboard. With a clang, the chessboard seemed to come alive. The black and white grids turned into a swamp, sinking William's bishop into it and slowly swallowing it. Those fellows are getting worse and worse, Isaac's disciples and grand-disciples. The old man's face was full of bored disdain, but if he didn't speak, if he didn't sit on the throne of the 12 protector kings, and if he didn't wear the distinctive purple robe with the lightning symbol, who would have guessed that this old wizard who looked like a human old man was the king of knowledge, Solomon, the leader of the 12 magi of the Silver School? In his most glorious era, his voice was the truth, his actions were the law, and he was the ultimate symbol of power and knowledge on the earth. Mortals thought that he had long become a god, but he was still Solomon, the Silver Folk, the most powerful person on the Bugis pillar. For the rest of his life, Solomon considered himself to be only a wizard. Better said than sung, isn't that the guy's usual style? Let them be, the Floss faction wants to have more influence on the course of the world. With great power comes great responsibility, isn't that their slogan? William had a smile on his face, and the chess piece in his hand moved erratically. Of course, actually they are not wrong, this is their responsibility, leave it to them, they are just a bunch of juniors. The old wizard knocked the chess piece in his hand on the table, and the chessboard and chess pieces suddenly turned into a pool of silver liquid. This pool of liquid shook on the table, as if it was afraid of William, and quickly flowed down from the table to the ground, escaping into the darkness. The old man raised his long eyebrows and laughed, but the Silver Elves are not to be trifled with, we just have to take care of our own affairs. But his eyebrows knitted together as he said this, and there was a hint of coldness in his old and wise eyes. He pursed his lips and added seriously, but we have to distinguish between friend and foe. If some opportunistic people think that they can seize the opportunity to hold the Senate hostage, they will get what they deserve. The alliance of Netas was established by the wizards by pressing their hands on the Book of Knowledge. Knowledge and power have never been separated, the law is to maintain order, but in the end, it is the sanction of the minority against the majority, and no one can question the authority of the Silver Alliance. The old man with silver hair was indifferent to these words. He frowned and stared at the few remaining chess pieces on the table. Lightning leaped on the clouds outside the window, illuminating his face 2 or 3 times, and the fine wrinkles on his forehead. Finally, Solomon raised his snow-white eyebrows, looked up, and said angrily, "No, you should have lost this game, William." "No, how could it be?" William innocently raised his eyebrows, as if he was still a child, and denied, "I still have some tricks up my sleeve." Solomon narrowed his eyes and stared at his old friend. "Come on, old friend, you see, playing chess is just a way for mortals to pass the time, we have already wasted too much time on it. You and I have both passed the age of arguing about victory and defeat. Everything is orderly and chaotic, but in the end, it all comes back to one. In some ways, those fellows of All for One are not wrong, but they do not understand that everything has its own meaning of existence. The course of the world is fixed, and any change by the hands of others will break the original balance. There is no wrong, and there is no right, everything is just going with the flow." The old mage hurriedly laughed, diverting the topic. Solomon saw that his old friend showed weakness, and did not continue on this topic, but thanks to you and Tolman, we discovered the abnormality of the sea of magic and the loop of trade winds in time, otherwise this time we would have been caught by those fellows. Although the Council of Elders will not be shaken, it will inevitably be awkward. The law of Tiamat also has imperfections, the mortals can only count on Martha, and we can only count on ourselves. But he raised his head again and asked, but what I really want to ask is, what is the master of the Mithril Fortress planning to do now? Tolman. The face of a young man suddenly appeared in William's mind. He is still staying in Erewhon, you know. Human emotions are a wonderful thing. Homeland, country, family, and friendship. Tolman's life in the mortal world has more or less changed him. He is probably planning to help that small country. As William spoke, he turned around, and a bolt of lightning fell, the fire of the lightning reflected in his eyes. It's not good to say it too easily, old friend. Even the silver folk have emotions, it's just that they don't show it that much. Solomon crossed his arms and replied, but your motives shouldn't be that simple, right? Other than the azure lance, did you discover something else? It's not really a discovery. Discovery is a very serious word. It should be said that I met an interesting little fellow by chance. It reminded me of an old friend. Ah, you're right, the silver folk have emotions too. William smiled slightly. I met that old friend when I passed through Erewhon in my early years. It's a pity that human life is too short. Yes, whether it's the ambition of a lion, or the firm and enduring faith of a white oak, in the human world, it will eventually be gradually forgotten with the passage of time. Only the law is different, because things that rely on emotions are fragile, only the truth is consistent. Solomon replied indifferently, but with the unique pride of the silver folk. It's a little in line with your style, but we can't help but be swayed by emotions, just like I asked you to do. During the time I'm gone, it's best not to let the radicals win too much support. I suspect there will be a war, but neither the Bugis nor the Silver Elves are ready yet. Solomon did not answer, but just put away the chess pieces on the table, even as William straightened up beside him. In the storm outside the window, in the midst of lightning and thunder, William stretched out his hand, and the staff immediately flew from the corner and landed firmly in his hand. Solomon then asked, I haven't asked yet, where are you going, and at this time? The old mage pulled on his hat, the shadow of the wizard's hat covering his face, only revealing the long silver beard below. I feel a little displacement in one of the monitoring nodes. If I'm not wrong, maybe something interesting will happen. Ah, I see. Solomon raised an eyebrow. The following speech was at its most intense moment, but unfortunately, the listeners were distracted. Dark clouds filled the sky. From the Grey Bay to the Shire Road, it was already raining heavily. Fortunately, the people of the Shire of Roe had already considered this when they built the city, and built perfect drainage facilities on both sides of the road. Every year after midsummer, the rain clouds would come from the Sea of Eternal Death, and would be blocked by the hanging cloud mountains, gathering into rain and slowly falling. But this year, the rain was especially plentiful, and the mountain torrents had already destroyed many bridges. A group of knights rushed out of the rain, and moved forward on the muddy path in the mountains with difficulty. In the heavy rain, the men and horses were all draped in sky-blue battle robes. The emblem on the battle robes was the pattern of a 9-headed snake, and most of the knights were also wearing elf-style battle armor. Under the pointed helmets, pointed ears and light green hair were exposed, proving their identity. Lord Marquis, it's just in front. A loud voice shouted, but it was almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. Did any of you see clearly what it was? The only tall elf in the group turned around on the back of his horse, his elven chainmail rattling, but he did not care about these details, and only used a serious tone to ask. The style of his armor was very exquisite, and light green magic seemed to be flowing on the surface of the armor, preventing the rainwater from entering. The tall elf turned his head and looked at his followers. His face was solemn, but he was very handsome, and his sky-blue eyes contained uneasiness and worry. A ball of fire, Lord. That was Sarah's tear. The knights stood in the rain, looking at each other. They did not know what this lord from the central province was worried about. Wasn't it just a meteorite? The mortals on the ground thought that meteorites and shooting stars were the tears of the dragons in the sky, and only a few witches thought that it was an omen of misfortune. However, most of the crystallized meteorites came from the sea of magic, and when a burning meteorite passed through the sky above the forest, it would sometimes cause a mountain fire. But the meteorite itself contained a large amount of magic crystals, which was a huge fortune, and every knight's heart was burning. But the tall elf did not answer. The world paid attention to these minor details, but few people noticed that since the year of flowers and summer leaves, the number of Sarah's tear had increased. In the county of Roe alone, there were more than 30 sightings. He remembered the data displayed in the file. Those numbers were meaningless in the eyes of an ordinary person, but in the eyes of a person of his status, they were like sharp blades inserted into the map, shining with a frightening cold light. The law of Tiamat was weakening. But how could this be? Marquis Stoffin turned his head and stared at the surging magic tide in the sky. The blue sky was like an arc of light reflected in his eyelids, but the light seemed a little deep. The knight around him did not know his true identity at all. The country people only thought that nobles like him from the central province were greedy and afraid of death, but they did not know that he was the Night Song Knight of the Holy Cathedral of Wind Empress. It was ridiculous. The border of Saint Tassel was becoming more and more unstable. Unfortunately, most of the nobles of the elven court still stubbornly believed that it was just the disturbance of the undead, but Madara did not have the energy to start two wars at the same time. He had a faint feeling that things were not that simple. The report of 7 months clearly indicated that the number of monsters at the border was increasing. To be precise, they were reproducing at an alarming rate. Lords from all over the country reported dozens of attacks, but they were deliberately concealed by the people below who pretended to be peaceful. These tricks could be hidden from the elven court, but not from the secret knight of the Holy Cathedral. The priests had mentioned more than once that the great demonic wave might just be a sign, and he, like the Summer King Shaglafen, suspected another possibility. I hope there is good news from Fanzin. The Holy Cathedral of Fire is really becoming more and more depraved. They are actually stuck in the mire of a small ruin. Stoffin silently hid these thoughts in his heart. He glanced at his temporary followers who had a look of indifference on their faces, turned around and pulled out his sword. The blade of the sword shone in the rain. Be careful of the monsters in the forest. Let's continue forward. The knight responded in unison and turned to move forward. But only Marquis Stoffin's heart was still shrouded in a shadow. He looked up in front of him. The dark forest was like a giant mouth that swallowed everything. In the heavy rain, he shivered. P.S. Those in the group today should know that I'm outside attending someone's wedding. Sigh, I shouldn't have gone. I started typing this chapter when I came back, and it messed up my schedule, but it feels good. I could have written a little more, but I looked at the time and decided not to. I'm now adjusting my work and rest schedule so that I can write regularly and update regularly in the future. That's it for today. I'll put up the 10,000 word chapter tomorrow before 5:00. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 753. Compared to the turmoil of the entire world, the stillness of the stained frost forest was more like a pool of stagnant water without ripples. The world inside and outside seemed to be separated by an invisible wall, leaving only the skylight that filled the dark night sky. The night passed through the forest, the pine trees rustling in the night wind, and it was not until the early hours of the morning that they gradually recovered some of the missing people. But what surprised Brando the most was that Freya and Lorena found the sleeping huntress in a small forest. Peyo was also the last person to return to the team, and her return was beyond Brando's expectations. The more confusion there was in the dream, the greater the power of seduction. Everyone knew about the nightmare in the huntress heart, and it should have been impossible for her to break free from the terrible dream that belonged to her. But she succeeded, and when she was found, she was sleeping quietly in a mossy field. The look on her face was like that of a sleeping princess, without the usual wildness of a hunter, but there were traces of tears on her face. Brando asked Maynard to check on the other person's condition, and after confirming that there was no major problem, he told the others not to disturb her. Peiya's dream had reached the final stage, and all that was left was to wait quietly for her to wake up. As long as she appeared outside the world of fog, it meant that she would wake up. There was no need to worry too much about the rest. The knights scattered among the woodland for a short rest according to Brando's orders. Brando also sat down against a cedar tree, and the little prince came over and asked for his sword back with a red face, and then ran away. Not far away, Maynard gave him a strange look, which made Brando feel a little guilty. Although he did not know why Maynard appeared in his and Haru's dream, presumably she had seen Haru's female attire. I hope that guy doesn't tell Her Royal Highness, he probably won't. Maynard doesn't seem like the kind of woman who gossips. Brando thought to himself. He suspected that if Princess Griffey knew what he had done, she might really stab him to death. Thinking about these messy things, he took out the equipment dropped by Viscount Caldel's negative emotions from the Dimension Cave to appraise. He twisted the shiny object out. It was a necklace. He placed the necklace in the palm of his left hand. The chain shone with a faint luster, as if it was made of silver. The pendant was in the shape of a circling heart. He vaguely felt that he had seen this item somewhere before. He thought for a moment and suddenly thought of a possibility. Could it be that thing? Brando's heart flashed with joy and he hurriedly opened his status panel. Atoya's determination, magic, strength plus 20 physique plus 20 wind resistance plus 5 fire resistance plus 5 water resistance plus 5 earth resistance plus 5 inch. It really is this thing. Brando felt a strange surprise in his heart. He subconsciously lifted the necklace and turned it around. Sure enough, he found a simple sentence engraved on the back of the pendant. T-H-O-S-S-E-M flame. It meant, all elements are for my use. This ancient text was the magic runes from before Wond was born. It existed even longer than the witch's words. However, these words had lost their magic and become a mere tool to store information. The text actually referred to the Azure Dragon, the ruler of the elements. Atoya was her name. However, after the fall of Babel Fortress, mortals preferred to call her the Calamity. This necklace could only be considered average at this level. However, it had a special meaning to Brando because, like the Ring of the Wind Empress, it was actually a quest item. The beginning and end of the Calamity, the jewel of the Dragonborn crown. This legendary item was the final reward of this series of quests. It could expand the pool of the 4 elements at the same time. It was one of the divine necklaces of the elementalists. It was also something that Brando was now determined to get. Originally, Brando planned to find a way to buy this quest necklace, but he did not expect to get it so easily. However, Atoya's determination itself was not a rare thing. The difficulty of this quest lay in the process, not the means to trigger it. Brando took off the Star of Flame from his neck. This necklace had been with him since the Eversong Forest, but the ruby on the pendant had long been shattered and destroyed in the last war in Ampere Seal. He put the Star of Flame beside him and took Atoya's determination with him. Although Atoya's determination was not the best, it was always better than nothing. Then Brando took another look at the dimension hole that was divided into 2 lines. In the dimension hole, there was a large pile of spoils from the loop of trade winds. Brando had never thought of organizing them. Among these messy things, there was a cylindrical object about the length of an arm that flickered with a dim light. He was slightly startled, and then remembered that it was a spoil from the battle with the demons. At first, Amandina had this thing, and then she passed it to him. He still had not figured out what it was used for. However, there was really nothing to understand about demon items. They were not things that could be controlled by mortals. Most of them had side effects of one kind or another, and the consequences of using them without authorization were generally not good. For example, Countess Dilfary was still unable to get out of bed and walk for a long time. The priests of the Holy Cathedral also said that her body had a hidden disease, and Brando had always felt guilty about it. However, this was still considered to be relatively light. It was not uncommon for people to lose their lives or even have their souls imprisoned forever because of using demon items. Brando thought of Dilfary and lost interest in the thing. Although the witches in the Cynthia area were good at inspecting demon items, he did not need to go there specifically. After inspecting the thing in his hand, his heart inexplicably calmed down along with the forest. The morning breeze began to blow through the canopy, making a soft sound that almost made people want to fall asleep. But no one could sleep, because as soon as they closed their eyes, they would think of the nightmare from before. Brando felt someone sitting beside him. It was Scarlet. She did not even need to ask for the permission of her lord to sit beside Brando. She looked back and watched Brando's movements quietly with her beautiful amber eyes. "What's the matter?" Brando asked. Scarlet took out a ring and handed it to Brando. Brando saw the ring in her hand. The ring looked very strange on the surface, a bit like someone had polished it with pebbles, very smooth and plain. But he froze for a moment before realizing that it was a magic ring. "Is this your lute?" Scarlet nodded. That was the relic of the lost one. It seemed that Scarlet's luck was not bad. He took the ring. The stone ring was very smooth to the touch, and the surface seemed to be satin, but he could not tell what it was. But Brando was not in a hurry to guess its attributes. This kind of stone artifact was very rare in Wonde, and some even witnessed the beginning of the whole world. He rubbed the inside of the ring with his hand and felt a line of thin dents. It was the text of the Mar people. "This is an ancient artifact." Brando could not help but exclaim, "Scarlet, you're really lucky." "Ha!" Scarlet looked at him, puzzled. Most of the magic items after the destruction of Babel Fortress came from after Tumen discovered the Mageweth, but before that, there were already all kinds of magic items. Brando explained, "These magic items are not necessarily more powerful than what we see now, but they are very strange." He held up the ring as he spoke, and the faint blue light in the sky shone through the leaves and branches, projecting from the hole in the middle of the ring, forming a beam of light. The attributes of the ring also appeared in his field of vision at the same time. Ring of Stone, Fantasy, Strength plus 75 additional skills, Eternal Kinship. When the ring bearer is on the ground, the additional attributes of the Ring of Stone are doubled. A leveled 40 ring added 150 strength. Although it was only on the ground, such extreme attributes were very rare in the magic items of the Mageweth era. Its additional skills also happened to illustrate this point. Ancient magic items generally focused on one aspect, but had a variety of restrictions. In the game, players said that they belonged to a special category of cursed items, and Brando felt that this was understandable. This ring did not have too many special skills, but just the increased attributes itself was enough to be amazing at this level. In particular, Brando suddenly thought that this ring was tailor-made for Scarlet. Because of the attributes of the Azure Lance and the strong physical recovery of the Dragonborn, she did not need to pay too much attention to defense, and this Ring of Stone was undoubtedly the best illustration of an all-attack warrior for her. "This is a ring blessed by Gaia." Brando put down the ring and replied to Scarlet, "You are very lucky, it is a trophy that belongs to you." Scarlet listened to Brando's answer and was a little quiet. She could roughly guess the preciousness of the ring, but only replied, "I don't need it, my lord. Believe me, compared to me, it suits you better." Brando smiled at the Highlander girl, "Give me your hand, I'll put it on for you." Scarlet was stunned. Brando was completely immersed in his own imagination. Offensive warriors were rare in the game because the way of combat determined that the survival ability of melee physical professions must be stronger than other professions. Close range meant that it was more difficult to avoid some range spells and attacks, and the necessary health and defensive ability to survive these battles. Professions like the nightingale could compensate with high-speed movement and dexterity, but what did a warrior have? What a warrior could rely on was nothing more than solid armor and a strong physique. But nothing was absolute, and Brando yearned for such a spirit in his heart. Because focusing on strength, a warrior became like an extremely sharp, but also extremely easy to break glass blade. Brando felt that this trait was very suitable for Scarlett's combat style. The girl inherited some of the characteristics of the Highlanders, and was unyielding in battle, so much so that when you watched such a lady in battle, it was difficult to imagine her usual temperament. But when Brando thought about it, he did not think about what his request meant to the Highlander girl. According to the customs of the Highlanders, only the most intimate of lovers would give each other rings. Of course, their rings did not have so much power, and sometimes were even just a garland, but it symbolized each other's restraint and admiration. Scarlett let Brando put the ring on her in a daze, and for a moment felt as if time had stopped flowing. Brando held her hand and carefully put the ring of stone on, then looked up and asked, "How is it?" "Ha!" Scarlett seemed to have just reacted. She tried to put aside those irrelevant thoughts and carefully felt it, then muttered, "It's amazing, my strength has increased by 20 to 30%. According to Miss Laws, it should be the strength of a young dragon, then it's close to the power of elemental awakening, but only at this level of strength. You can feel it carefully, this will be good for your elemental awakening in the future. But remember, you only have this kind of strength when you're on the ground. If you fight, try to avoid being led to other battlefields by others," Brando warned. "Okay." Scarlett was silent and nodded, but then whispered, "I can also elemental awakening, my lord. You're more knowledgeable than others, and the elemental wall will not be your threshold. Besides, the blood flowing in your body is golden, you should be more proud than others, you never have to belittle yourself, Scarlett." Brando looked at Scarlett and whispered encouragement. The Highlander girl did not answer, but clenched the azure lance in her hand. Brando noticed this detail and guessed what she was thinking. He looked back. The whole dream quest was a complete dungeon quest, there were quests and experience, and there was a lot of it. He opened the panel and found that with the remaining part from before, it was almost enough to upgrade the Templar Knight to the next level. Originally, in Brando's plan, continuing to upgrade the Templar Knight's level was not the best choice, but since he found that his physique had been further strengthened after elemental awakening, he changed his mind. Since the strengthening was the physique, then the Templar Knight's tank-type route did not seem unacceptable. He thought about it for a moment and chose to upgrade his level. The attribute bonuses of high-level professions had become extremely high in the later stages, and after 10 levels, Brando could almost feel his overall strength rising by a level, almost a third of the original. In fact, the period after crossing the elemental wall was the fastest time to level up. He had experienced this in the game, but after going through the elemental enlightenment, the speed of gaining experience would slow down 1,000 times. After that, he would have to slowly accumulate experience. Fortunately, the players with the system were several times faster than the natives. Not long after, the news of the Hunter Girl's awakening came. Freya brought him the news, and when Brando and Scarlett went to take a look, they saw the Hunter Girl's thick eyelashes move slightly, and then she opened her eyes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 754. At this time, almost half an hour had passed since she was discovered, and Brando saw Peya, who had just woken up, look at her surroundings blankly. There seemed to be a trace of confusion in her eyes, and the confusion in her dark eyes turned into a strong sense of vigilance. She suddenly turned over and bounced up from the ground like a female beast, and her hand subconsciously reached for the short bough behind her back. But she was destined to catch nothing. Then Peya woke up, and when she saw Brando, she seemed to be stunned. "Ah. I'm sorry, Sir Knight. I thought," but Peya's words suddenly stopped. Brando saw a look of horror on her face, and she turned around and glanced at the surrounding forest as if she had seen a ghost. "How could? It's exactly the same." Peya suddenly took a few steps back, ignoring everyone around her. She observed the surrounding forest as she retreating faster and faster, and then ran wildly, disappearing into the forest in the blink of an eye. Peya's action stunned everyone, and Brando was also slightly startled, and then noticed that the direction the hunter maiden had disappeared in was the exit to Milo's breath. "Brando?" Freya asked from the side. "What's wrong with Peya? Should we go after her?" Everyone looked at each other, not knowing what had happened, and Brando himself was also confused. Peya's previous behavior was not that of a reckless person. On the contrary, she could be called an excellent hunter. And most of the best hunters had one trait in common: calm and collected. Brando only hesitated for a moment before saying, "Follow her." Faint starlight began to appear in the forest, indicating that they were leaving the range of the Evernight forest. In the dim light, Brando saw the hunter maiden in front of him shuttling through the forest like a vigorous female leopard. She was not stubbornly going deep into the forest, but instead seemed to be scouting the way, occasionally stopping to wait for them. This made Brando feel a little more at ease. What he hated the most in a group operation was to leave one's post without permission and put others in danger. Such an action was selfish and stupid. But it seemed that Peya had not lost her mind, and Brando occasionally saw her stop and look around with a puzzled look on her face. This confirmed his conjecture that the hunter maiden must have discovered something in the dream. Sometimes dreams would reveal the future, and such a chance was extremely small, but if Peya's and her brother's dreams were entangled, it was not impossible. Brando realized that Peya might have seen the direction in which Grand Duke Arek and the others were heading in. This was the only possibility that could make the young hunter girl lose her composure. However, this at least meant that her brother was not dead. At least, he was not dead when they passed through this forest. In this way, the team moved forward for about 2 or 3 hours under Peya's leadership. During this time, the huntress never deviated from the direction leading to the glacier, which further showed that Brando's hunch was correct. If Arek and the others had also passed through here, they would not have easily left the correct route. And it was at this time that the hunter maiden finally stopped. Brando parted the bushes with a crash and caught up with her from behind with everyone. He saw Peya standing blankly under a cedar tree. Brando walked over to take a look and saw that Peya was holding a dagger in her hand. This dagger definitely did not belong to the hunter maiden, because her dagger was still clipped to her boots. Other than that, Peya should not be armed with any weapons. "Is this your brother's thing?" Brando glanced at the dagger, which was just a very ordinary animal skin knife. Nobles would not use such a vulgar thing, and only hunters in this area would use it. The hunter maiden turned her head, and Brando was surprised to see her red eyes. Peya rubbed the corners of her eyes, took a breath to calm down, and replied, "Can the dream be real, my lord?" "What's wrong?" "I don't know. I was alone in the dream, and I dreamed of everything that happened that day. I dreamed that I was dead, frozen to death in the river, but my soul was muddled, and I seemed to hear a voice calling me. I saw the pale night, and I followed them in a daze. I saw my brother, and I saw those people that day. They passed through this forest and moved forward slowly, and I saw my brother following them, behind a taller figure. I saw him pass by here and fall. I called him, but he didn't answer me, and I saw his dagger fall here." Peya lowered her head and looked at the dagger in her hand with some fear. "It's here." "What else did you see?" Brando immediately realized that this should be her brother's dream, and her brother should have also experienced the dream of the lost names, and then left part of his memory here. But he was a little curious. Her brother's dream was so incomplete, and it seemed that he had passed through here, which was incredible, and he could not help but continue to ask. I saw them walk into an ice field, the wind and snow covered their figures, and I stayed there forever. The huntress looked up, her eyes flashing with a strange panic, and she shuddered. Am I dead, Sir Knight? She looked at Brando blankly and asked, almost trembling. Am I a ghost now? Brando felt that the huntress's question was a little absurd, but he could probably understand the panic in Peya's heart. Not everyone knew the mysterious legends like he did, and most of the country people would attribute incomprehensible things to ghosts and gods. He coughed to wake Peya up. You're not dead, the dream is absurd, but part of what you saw may be true. Your younger brother might have survived as well. Just like what you saw, that part is actually the memory he left behind here. Peya heard this and trembled all over. Really? Of course, you understand, I don't have to lie to you. Brando replied. Peya clenched her hands into fists with excitement, her chest rose and fell rapidly. She turned around and thought for a moment, then turned back and said to Brando with some embarrassment, I'm sorry, Sir Knight, I was a little too reckless before. Brando sighed. What else could he say? You can ask a soldier to abide by military discipline, but Peya was certainly not a soldier, nor an adventurer or a mercenary, she was just a hunter. But he still lectured her. Just remember in the future, what you did before was very dangerous, not just for you, but for others as well. The knight behind you, some of them are like you, have brothers, sisters, or parents of children. Do you have the heart to let their loved ones lose them? I'm sorry. Peya hung her head in shame this time. She knew that nobles had many rules, and people of her status did not need to ask why at all, they just needed to abide by them. But Brando explained it to her, which made her blush instead. Although she was in awe of those high and mighty nobles, she did not necessarily agree with their values deep down, but Brando's words made her realize that people were actually the same, and the rules in a team were just to protect everyone in it. For the first time, Brando accepted the hunter girl's apology, not for his identity, but for such behavior. Can you determine the route of Grand Duke Aurek and the others? He asked again. The hunter girl was slightly startled, then nodded. That's easy. Brando replied. Glacier of Despair. Ever since entering this boundless ice field, Olaz had not stopped losing her temper for a single day. She felt that if she had known this would happen, she would have been with Brando instead of listening to him and going to meet up with Veronica with that dull ash sword saint. Of course, there were many things that made her dissatisfied. For example, the cold climate made her skin rougher, and the chattering ambassador of the Crew's Night Order also pushed her patience to the limit. Which I did. That guy used to see that she was one of Erwin's people, and dared to talk to her with that kind of attitude. If she did not want to expose her identity, she would have turned into her dragon form and swallowed the other party in one gulp, so that her ears would not be bombarded with fatigue all day long. It was the same for the descendants of the arrogant Kurlutzian nobles. Sometimes, she would secretly squint and stare at those annoying guys with her golden eyes, hatefully thinking about whether to cut open all these arrogant guys' stomachs after this matter was over. But that was just a thought. Although the dragons were arrogant, they were not stupid. The holy cathedral of fire behind the Crew's nobles would never allow the dragons to mess around in human territory. Of course, the 4 holy cathedrals were not the key was those annoying, self-righteous Bugas. Every time she thought of the existence of the silver folk in this world, Olaz could not help but gnash her teeth in hatred. If it were not for the Bugas, who always boasted of being messianic craftsmen, the dragons would have already turned humans and elves into toys. How annoying! Olaz cursed fiercely in her heart, cursing the smiling old man to crash his head and die as soon as possible, and for Onais and the other floating cities to fall into the sea as soon as possible. She curled a few curls of her platinum hair around her ears and muttered as she walked out of her tent. If it were not for the news that Brando and his party had arrived, she would not have bothered to show up. It was so cold outside. The silver folk, who had ill intentions towards the dragons, called them big lizards. Allahs of course could not accept this name, but dragons were indeed cold-blooded animals, and there was no disputing that. Except for the white dragons, most of the other types of dragons would feel uncomfortable in cold weather. Allahs sneezed in the snow and rubbed the tip of her little red nose. She looked like a weak loli, not a scary little female dragon. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 755. If Allah's curse were to come true, it would be enough to destroy the entire Bugha's wizard craftsmen and their floating city 10 times over, and there would be nothing left of them. Even Brando would be implicated. For example, our little female dragon lady cursed Brando at least 20 times to make him lose the ability to reproduce. Fortunately, Brando was unaware of these vicious curses at the moment. He and Veronica agreed to meet in the valley near the Breath of Despair. Cruz's people were indeed one step ahead of them. Veronica and the Ash Sword Saint were both long-established powerhouses, and the Forest of Tears in front of them was unlikely to stop their progress. Even if Allah's was lazy and did not contribute, a small level 50 dungeon would not cause any trouble for Cruz's people. When Brando stepped into the camp of the Azure Skies Legion, Veronica was frowning in the thick felt tent, one hand on her forehead, looking at the map in her hand. This map was actually provided by Duke Vero, whom Eek had persuaded. The Lantan Islands had left early and arrived at Fort Valendon, and even Her Royal Highness, who left later, had already arrived in the Manowar area. But seriously speaking, Duke Lantan Island and the Holy Cathedral of Fire, especially Cruz's people, had no friendship, and had a lot of enmity. So the female commander of the Azure Skies Legion knew very well that the young man named Eek was probably helping them because of Brando's face. And when she thought of the young man Erwin she saw in the loop of trade winds, she could not help but smile slightly, but then she sighed. Of course, she had heard of what had happened in Ampere Seal. She was a general of the Empire, and of course she knew where the interests of the Empire lay. She knew that the young man might become a difficult opponent for the Empire, but she did not expect this day to come so soon. She looked up and glanced at Mephisto, who was not far away with his arms crossed and looking straight ahead. The Ash Sword Saint did not have a good impression of the Cruz people, so he rarely went anywhere other than to discuss matters with Veronica. In fact, even if he was willing to go, Veronica might not feel at ease. For the people of Cruz, he was a big devil. That good student of yours is here. Aren't you going to do something? She asked. Mephistopheles looked back at her and didn't answer. He had nothing to say to Cruz. If Veronica hadn't promised to help him restore his country, he probably wouldn't even be in the mood to appear here. However, when Veronica mentioned Brando, the Ash Blade Master could not help but feel proud. This time, Brando had taught Cruz a lesson in Ampere Seal. Even the Ash Blade Master himself had never done such a thing. The key was the use of the relationship between the Bugis and the Silver Elves to force the Cruz people to suffer in silence. This move was simply played beautifully. Mephistopheles couldn't help but be satisfied. However, if he could make Cruz bleed more, he might be even more satisfied. Veronica didn't mind seeing him like this. She was already used to it. At this time, she heard footsteps coming from outside the tent. She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows, and her eyes moved slightly. She had already recognized the voices of Brando and his party, but to her surprise, Brando's footsteps were steadier than before. Small details could explain a lot in the eyes of a strong person like her. There were rumors that Count Tonagel had broken through the elemental wall, but she had always doubted it. Outsiders didn't know, but she knew. How old was he? But at this moment, Veronica couldn't help but look up in surprise and murmur, Erwin actually has another temple knight who has elemental activation. Martha above, how old is he? Hearing Veronica's sigh, Mephistopheles couldn't help but smile. The world knew him as the Ash Sword Saint. His reputation was not only in the Cruz Empire, but also in the wider world. He challenged the descendant of one of the four sages with one sword. A huge empire, even the eagle that spread its wings and made everyone tremble, was like an ordinary thing in front of him. But after all, the empire was not something a mortal like him could compare to. Cruz would live forever, and sooner or later he would turn into dust. People often said that dynasties rose and fell, but the cycle of dynasties was ultimately longer than a person's life. After he died, who would still remember the name of the Ash Sword Saint? But now he had a student, and this student was destined to achieve greater things than him. A 20-year-old temple knight who had elemental activation, the chosen one, was nothing more than that. But Brando was not the kind of person who was destined to be Martha's favorite at birth. In the eyes of others, his fate was controlled by him. The young man came from Bucci, and was just a descendant of a Highland knight. The protection of his ancestors had no impact on his life. If there was an ancient noble in Aween who used his own sword to plow his own land, then there was no one else in Aween. Then it must be Brando. The late King Eric, the Flame King Gretel, was nothing more than that. Some people's names were destined to shine in history, and Mephistopheles knew that his student was such a person. Maybe Cruz people could still be high and mighty now, but what about in a few decades? History always gave heroes space, and even Brendel himself did not realize it. But someone like the Ash Sword Saint, who had seen many things in his life, had already seen the cause and effect of this. He had always been arrogant, but he had to admit that the best decision he had made in his life was to choose Brando as his student. With such a student, the teacher would also be proud of it. The snow and wind whistled outside the tent. The sky had been dark ever since the beginning of the demonic wave. In any era, this was a sign of the beginning of chaos. Heroes were born, and even Mephistopheles couldn't help but sigh. Brando had already opened the tent and walked in, followed by Freya, Scarlet, Medisha, and the Shire. He saw Mephistopheles first, and quickly nodded to the Ash Sword Saint. He was already the lord of a territory, but the Ash Sword Saint was still his teacher in name, and he had taught him a lot. Brando now only had respect for the Ash Sword Saint. Only then did his gaze fall upon Veronica. In fact, he had long noticed that the female Azure Skies Legion's gaze had also long since fallen upon him. Legion Commander, I didn't expect to meet you again so soon. Brando smiled and greeted her. I should have captured you and Endesha back to the Empire. I didn't expect you to cause so much trouble for me so quickly. Veronica glared at Brando and snorted in anger. Look at what you've done, brat. You probably don't know, but the Empire's noble senate is about to turn upside down. Brando naturally knew, but he took off his cloak and handed it to the knight behind him. He then raised his head and looked at the Azure Skies Legion commander with bright eyes. Lady Veronica, you also know that you won't get any benefits from pushing all the blame on me. I'm different from the lame nobles like Erwin, and you're also different from the arrogant nobles like Cruz. There's no need to point out anything, right? Also, I helped you capture Endesha, but His Majesty didn't give me any rewards. Brando added. Veronica couldn't help but look at this brat with amusement and anger. Lame Erwin nobles was a proverb used by Cruz to mock the people of Erwin. It meant that the nobles of Erwin would bow down to the people of Cruz. An even worse usage was lame dog. But Brando felt that lame dog was not enough to describe certain people. In his opinion, the nobles of this era of Erwin nobles were a derogatory term. At least compared to the nobles of ancient times, the nobles of today were just wriggling parasites. You still want a reward? Do you know who you've killed? That's Williams. Don't tell me he really relied on his own ability to become one of the 7 deputy commanders of the Holy Cathedral Knight. The nobles of the Empire don't have a huge family behind them. Do you know how much trouble you've caused? Veronica replied angrily. Brando spread out his hands. Anyway, I'm not going to the Empire. They can't come to Erewhon to trouble me. As long as Repassin or Duke Baishin don't send troops to Erewhon's border, do you think I'm afraid they'll find someone to assassinate me? That's not impossible. Veronica put on a straight face, but she was relieved when Brando mentioned Repassin and Duke Baishin. She admired this young man and was really afraid that he would kill Williams because he was young and impetuous. But since he knew what kind of strength was behind that guy, it meant that he must have been prepared. She took a closer look at Brando and sighed. It's easy for you to say. In that case, why are you still here to help me? Brando was not embarrassed that Veronica saw through his intentions. After all, to be able to become the commander of the Empire's Legion, the other party was naturally not a simple person. Besides, the family behind Veronica had nothing to do with Duke Baishin. As long as there was no intersection between big families, there must be conflicts. Brando felt that this was a win-win cooperation. He needed Veronica to help him maintain at least his reputation in the Empire, at least not to be called a heretic. Veronica also needed his help now, and in the future, Brando believed that the relationship between the two would only be closer. As long as he started to develop the Black Forest. However, he didn't intend to say these plans out loud. He just smiled and thanked Veronica sincerely. Thank you. Although Brando maintained the arrogance of a soul from the modern era, he actually knew that Veronica's position was not on the same level as his. One could almost say that she was the Empire's Grand Duchess, and he was only half a count in Erewhon, because Tonajel was never a count's territory. He could completely feel that she appreciated him and was willing to help him. Although he knew that the two of them might be on opposite sides, Brando made up his mind to at least not embarrass this female Legion commander too much in the future. This was not difficult to do. Although Cruz was arrogant, at least he was not to the point where he would anger the heavens and the people. He paused for a moment and decided to change the topic. Back to the topic, we just came out of the Black Forest outside. Legion Commander, you must have been waiting here for a while, right? Speaking of this, Veronica suddenly sighed. Yes, we ran into some trouble, Brando. Trouble? P.S. The proofreading took some time. There are 2 other things I have to inform you. First, don't ask me where C-92 went. Second, because many people want me to respond to a lot of questions about the setting and the era, it is impossible for me to answer them one by one. I thought about it. From today onwards, if you have any questions about the setting, you can raise them in the book review section. I will be free from 9 to 9:30 every night, and I will come to the book review section to answer these questions one by one. If you have any questions you want to ask in person, you can wait until then. However, I will try my best to avoid answering questions related to the plot and character creation. Generally speaking, only the setting is involved. I know that there are some contradictions in my setting. After all, the time is too long, so let's discuss and fix it together. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 756. Trouble. Veronica tightened the fur coat on her body, revealing the graceful curves of the female Legion under the coat. It was the same color as the light brown background of Kurlut's winter military uniform, the same color as Kurlut's famous brown rock. She walked towards Brando, passed by him, lifted the blanket, and looked out warily. The cold wind whistled, making everyone in the tent shiver. The lady put down the blanket, turned around, and said seriously, "What I'm about to tell you, you can only listen with your ears, and keep your mouth shut, everyone. There are 300 soldiers in this camp, but from today onwards, the food reserves are only enough to last until next week. Brendel suddenly understood why Veronica was so serious about this matter. If this news were to spread, it would definitely cause a commotion. This was the army brought by Veronica, which was the elite of crews. If it was the private army of the nobles, it was not impossible to cause a riot. Cruz's tacticians called the food reserves that were enough to support an army for a week. Normally, an army participating in a war would consume 2 basic units of food a week, and the garrison would be relatively less. If the food reserves were less than 4 basic units, it meant that an army that could still fight would have to consider whether to retreat or not. If the food reserves were less than 2 units, it would only happen if they were in a desperate situation. If an army with less than 1 unit did not riot, it meant that the commander had suppressed the news very well, or that the army was very elite, or both. However, Veronica had participated in the last Holy War and was a well-known general of crews. With the title of Goddess of War, she would never make a low-level mistake in this kind of issue. Brendel seemed to have immediately guessed why the Kurlutz people were facing the current predicament, and he asked with some understanding, "Is part of your food missing?" "How do you know?" Veronica suddenly turned her head, and her originally frowned brows relaxed, but immediately frowned again. "Do you know something, Brando?" she asked suspiciously. "Don't you know what lives in this snowfield? Didn't I ask Alaz to remind you?" Brando was equally confused. This snowy plain was the lair of that damned Frost Wyrm, and this little one just so happened to be a famous glutton. It was very timid, and only knew how to steal the food of travelers. It had been doing this in this forest and Lake Valendon all year round, so it was very skilled at its job. If normal people did not pay attention, they would easily fall for its tricks. Of course, other than being proficient in this field. This Frost Wyrm whelp was also an expert at sneak attacks and sneak attacks. In short, it would never fight you head-on. If there are any vile adjectives, they must be reserved for it. Alaz. Veronica thought for a while before she remembered the doll-like girl who had accompanied Mephistopheles. But the only impression she had was that she always had a sour expression on her face. She did not understand why Brendel would let a little girl pass such an important message to her. Veronica looked at Mephistopheles. Brando saw Veronica's expression and understood that Alaz had done something good. No, she might have forgotten about it long ago. That girl. He suddenly realized that he had made a mistake. He should have let someone more reliable come, such as Amandina. Brando could only tell her about the rumor about the dragon on the lakeside road. Veronica walked back to her seat, glanced at the parchment map, and threw the hair pelt in her hand on the table. The table was actually made up of a few boxes. "You mean, the one who stole our food is that dragon whelp? But that's nearly 2 months' worth of food for 300 people, 3 whole carriages. Dragons always have some mysterious spells. If it wants to hide its tracks, it's not difficult to not be discovered by you." Brando was also a little helpless. If a dragon wanted to steal your things, it would be really difficult to deal with. It's really surprising that dragons would use their noble spells to steal. This is a little different from what I read in the books. A girl in white in the corner suddenly spoke. Brando had noticed her early on. The girl had a cute baby face, a white scholar's hat on her head, eyes as blue as the sea. She was wearing a long robe with 2 blood-red crosses on her shoulders, a pair of gray squirrel leather gloves, and a thick book with a small brass cross hanging from the end of the book between the pages. "I'm sorry, I'm not questioning your words, I'm just curious." Seeing Brando's gaze sweep over, the girl hurriedly explained with a smile. "And this is?" Brando read some confidence from the other party's clear and transparent eyes. The girl was obviously not good at hiding her thoughts. Although she tried her best to appear approachable, she still gave the Erewhon people present the feeling of being treated as barbarians. This was a typical Cruse aristocrat's sense of superiority, but it had not yet turned into arrogance. She must be a child who left home for the first time. Shido, she's a descendant of Marquis Toon and is now studying at St. Eberson. She's a smart child with outstanding talent. Brando, you'll definitely like her. A wizard from the Mithril Society also took a fancy to her talent and hoped that she could enter the White Tower for further studies. Veronica did not reprimand the girl for interrupting, but looked at the other party with gratified eyes as she introduced, not hiding her affection. St. Eberson Academy. Buga people. Brando's heart sunk. It was indeed a great talent to be chosen by the Silver Folk. Of course, there was also enough luck. He asked, Marquis Toon. Is it the Conqueror Toon who crossed the sea on a dragon-headed warship and conquered Chevilian? It's my ancestor. The girl's eyes lit up slightly. She probably did not expect that there would be someone in Erewhon who could tell the origin of her family, especially the legend of her ancestor conquering the Chevilian area. She had always yearned for it and was also the pride of her family. You're treating Erewhon as an uncivilized area. Brando saw the look in Shido's eyes and knew what she was thinking. He glanced at the other party's attire. The cross on the white shirt was a typical Blood Cross emblem. The Blood Cross was a prestigious scholars' organization in Cruse. Its status was a bit similar to Erewhon's Royal School of Geography, but the Blood Cross did not have such a young member. He must be an honorary apprentice in name. Then who is this? Brando looked at the corner of the tent. He had already noticed the man who had been quiet and had not spoken. The other party was wearing a coat sewn with mink, and under the coat was a military uniform, but there was no family emblem on the silver breastplate, only an eagle emblem. This kind of attire looked a bit like a mercenary, but the plaid trousers, brand new deerskin boots, and the gem on the hilt of his sword proved that the other party's identity must be extraordinary. This was a man who could keep his composure. As soon as Brando walked into the tent, he saw him and Shido standing behind Veronica together. But unlike the frivolous curiosity of the other young scholar, this older young man had not spoken, but looked at them with sharp eyes in the dark. His silence made Brando feel a soldier's reticence. But until this moment, Leneret Aurelius. Before Veronica could speak, the young man answered in a cold tone, as if he could be proud of this surname. After he answered, he closed his mouth and resumed his previous silence. So it's you. When Brando heard the name, he thought that the other party could indeed be proud of this surname, because it once belonged to a man with the name of an eagle, and the words associated with it were the Empire and the Supreme Power, His Majesty the Emperor. But at this moment, Brando could not help but think of Lorena and Philas strangely, for no other reason than that the other party was the victim who was rashly killed in Philas' dream, the eldest grandson of Emperor Grandity the Great. And also the future His Majesty the Emperor. Brando also did not expect that the future legend would appear in front of him, and so young at that, he could not help but take another look at the other party. As if noticing his look, Veronica's face showed a smile of amusement. Now I don't need to introduce you, little guy. Brando smiled bitterly. Of course there was no need for that. The nobles of Cruse had an ancient practice of sending their children out to gain experience, but this tradition was no longer followed by most families, because too many outstanding descendants died in the experience because of assassinations and accidents. But the royal family of Cruse was really bold. Dragons are high and mighty in the eyes of us mortals, but they also have many eccentricities. For example, they have an almost paranoid greed for wealth. As far as I know, this time we are facing a timid young dragon. It chose to act sneakily, not because of the dragon's nature, but because of its personality, Brando continued. A timid dragon, huh? Interesting. Teacher was right, you can only see this complicated world clearly when you go out of the door, Shido praised with some surprise. Don't underestimate it because it's timid. No matter what, dragons are terrible opponents. Even if it's just a young dragon, even the most cowardly person would dare to easily crush an ant to death. Brendel warned. You're right, Shido nodded politely at him. This little guy. Brando was a little speechless. Veronica, however, heard the hidden meaning in his words, narrowed her eyes and asked, Brando, you mean you can find it? I don't have the ability to track a dragon, that's the job of the elven dragon hunters in Esatok, but I happen to know where it's hiding. Brando smiled slightly. You know where it's hiding. Veronica's green eyes lit up, she turned her head and couldn't help but praise, you really didn't let me down, little guy, it seems like nothing can stop you. You flatter me, I was just lucky. Don't forget, I'm on good terms with Duke Anthony, and Duke Vero isn't against forming an alliance with me. They're the real masters of this place. This young dragon has been living in this area for quite some time, and the locals can't be ignorant of it, Brendel replied humbly. However, Veronica seemed to be really troubled by this matter. She still looked at Brando with appreciation. Brando, you make me regret, I mean at your age, sigh, if only you were willing to join the Cruz Empire, how great would that be? Aren't I standing with the army commander now? The army commander's hospitality was a little overwhelming for Brando, but he couldn't choose to become a Cruz noble anyway. He chuckled and cleverly changed the topic. Humph, Veronica snorted softly, expressing her dissatisfaction with Brando's perfunctory answer. She picked up the map on the table, shook the dust off it, and asked, where is the dragon? It seems that we have to catch it before it uses all our food to fill its stomach. Army commander, are you going to move now? But compared to Veronica's haste, Brando seemed calmer. Veronica looked back at him in confusion. Of course, we can't delay it any longer. I don't know how long this matter can be kept a secret. I've already ordered the food ration to be reduced, but this is only a temporary measure. Sooner or later someone will figure it out. She suddenly stopped and asked, Brando, do you have any other ideas? Brando nodded. Actually, I brought you a message. Message? Good or bad? If it's good news, tell me. If it's bad news, then forget it, there's enough bad news, let's put it aside first. Veronica froze for a moment, then replied with the willfulness of an army commander. She walked behind the table and took her long sword from the shelf. Brando looked at the woman a little helplessly. Before we came here, we found traces of a wreck. Veronica's hand froze. She put down the sword with a click, turned back, her emerald eyes flashing with a glimmer, and looked at Brando strangely. Are you here to bring me good news today, little guy? It seems that the Holy Cathedral of Fire is really worried about this batch of portal fragments. Brando looked at her, but replied to himself. You guy. No, of course we are anxious. Do you know how much face the Empire has lost this time? You have a part to play in this, don't be too proud, someone will settle the score with you. Veronica saw Brando smile and knew what he was thinking. Brando glanced at the other two. Lenoret was silent and unmoved by his and Veronica's words, sitting there like a sculpture, while Shido held a book in both hands and looked at him curiously. In Cruz, Brando was now a household name. Since the last Holy War, had the people of Cruz ever been defeated? Tell me, what the hell is going on? Veronica asked. Brando then told the story of the huntress, and when she heard what had happened to Peya, Veronica's face did not show much sympathy, but said coldly, Erek is digging his own grave. In the end, she turned back and asked carefully, you said that the girl followed the trail all the way here, which means that her brother is still alive, and left marks all the way, telling you that Erek had passed through this area. She looked puzzled, but what is the connection between these two things? Are you trying to say that Erek is also moving towards the young dragon's lair? Exactly, Lady Veronica. Before coming here, in order to avoid leaking the news, there is one thing I actually did not tell you. Brando replied, "You already know that Erech's trip is for the heart of the dragon, but you don't know that the heart of the dragon is in the Glacier of Despair, guarded by the young dragon." Veronica was stunned for a long time. "So you have some kind of conspiracy, right?" She stared at Brando and asked, "What do you mean by conspiracy?" But Brando still nodded. "Whether it's an adult dragon or a young dragon, it's not so easy to deal with, and Erech may not dare to say that he has it in the bag, so I suspect that they will go to one place first." "Where?" "The Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator." When Veronica heard the name, it was as if she had been pricked by a needle. She narrowed her emerald eyes, revealing a dangerous light. "I've heard of this place. You're not going to tell me that those things are still alive, are you?" Of course they were still alive. The alpha wolf Achis was only temporarily sealed and fell into a demigod slumber, not to mention her children. Back then, the dusk wolves chased the father of the giants, Milos the frost weaver, to this place. After a great battle, the frost giant god fell here, and Achis' blood also flowed on the snowy plains, and foul creatures were born from it. Those dark children were later sealed, but still slept in the holy cathedral of the Hibernator. Erech certainly had no way to deal with a young dragon. His only chance was to release those children of Achis. Brando almost immediately guessed the Duke's idea. But the Duke certainly did not know what he was about to release. It was not the mixed bloodlines of the calamity of wolves, but the real pure-blooded demonic wolves born from Achis' blood, the real creatures of chaos. Opening the holy cathedral of the Hibernator would also open the path to the team dungeon at the center of the stained frost forest labyrinth. But fortunately, Brando knew that it was a seal based on time, and unless it was opened from the inside, Erech was bound to be disappointed. But he had an idea, and this idea would not only make Erech return empty-handed, but also make him suffer a great loss. This idea, to say that it was a conspiracy, did not seem to be a completely unreliable thing. Seeing the look on his face, Veronica knew that the young man had a well-thought-out plan. However, now was not the time to discuss action plans. She chose to believe in the young man, but she also said, "It seems that you have thought about what to do, but I still have a question. What exactly is the heart of the dragon you speak of?" "I once thought it was the heart of a dragon." "Well, Brando was somewhat innocent. I don't know." "What?" Veronica immediately revealed a murderous look. "Lady Veronica, you also know." Brando glanced at the big book in Shido's hand. "Much of the knowledge of wizards comes from books, and before you really see it, you rarely know what it is. You don't think that my experience is so rich that I have seen everything, do you?" A sly answer. Veronica glared at him. "Don't think that I don't know what you are hiding from me. You go rest first, wait for me to gather the others." Brando broke out in a cold sweat under the stare of the Legion commander. He did not expect Veronica to see through his lies. It was just that he did not lie about the origin of the heart of the dragon, but he did not tell the Legion commander that the reason he knew all this was not from books, but from a game with the same name as this world. This was something that could not be explained in the first place, was it not? Brando did not intend to be entangled in this issue. He simply bowed to the female Legion commander, turned around, and prepared to leave with the others. But at this time, Shido followed closely behind. Before Brando lifted the felt of the tent, she shouted, "Mr. Brando." Brando turned around. "What? I was just a little curious." "Mr. Brando, you are the most knowledgeable Erewhon person I have ever met. Do you really know the habits of the dragon race?" Shido asked curiously in a low voice. But Brando always felt that there was a hint of suspicion in her pure and innocent eyes. "No, I don't know." He simply shook his head. There were some things that could never be explained to such a prejudiced little girl, especially when the other party was a stubborn scholar, a female scholar. "I've only heard rumors. I also heard that dragons especially like human girls, and would snatch beautiful girls back to their lairs. Did you know that? Shido's eyes widened. Her blue eyes were like sapphires. She looked at Brando with sparkling eyes. Mr. Brando, you really know how to joke. I have never heard of this. How smart. Brando thought. The girl hesitated for a moment before asking, Mr. Brando, I heard that you are a descendant of the Highland Knight. I heard that the people of Cartier still maintain their tradition of marrying stepmothers and daughters-in-law as wives. I heard that after your death, your souls are not purified in flames, but collected and stored in jars and buried on both sides of the road. Is this all true? Brando looked at this girl strangely. He was stunned for a moment before answering with a straight face, yes. Not only that, we also maintain the habit of drinking raw meat and drinking blood. If there is a disagreement, we will draw our swords and kill. Where we come from, women can have many men, and men can have many women. How is it, are you scared? Shido was stunned. Her face was full of disbelief. The girl just stared at Brando with her mouth open. Sorry, Brando looked at her and added, what I said before was a lie. P.S. That's all for today. 6K words. I have to go out in a while. I will come back later to look at the book reviews section and answer any questions from yesterday. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 757. The ice and snow were like the tip of a knife, flashing and freezing to the bone. The trees on both sides of the glacier were shaped like ice crystals, standing coldly. The cold wind passed through the woodland, bringing with it the sound of subtle breathing. Freya clasped her hands together and stared at the vast expanse of white glaciers below. There were sparse black dots scattered on the glaciers, and a team of about a few hundred people was moving forward with great difficulty. The scene in her field of vision was faintly discernible, occasionally obscured by the wind and snow. The future goddess of war frowned, her eyebrows covered in snow. She was wearing a thick cloak, which almost completely covered the fur-inlaid armor underneath. She looked like a hunter hiding in the forest. Her field of vision extended outwards. Hundreds of soldiers in the same silver cloak were hiding in the bushes, motionless. From a distance, they were almost the same color as the snow. Maynard looked at the time. The pocket watch was almost creaking due to the low temperature, but the needle was not wrong. She handed the pocket watch to Freya. Is it them? It's them. Freya nodded in confirmation. Seeing that those people were almost the same as what Brando had said to her, and there should not be a third force here. We're lucky that their half-baked lord guessed it right. Not far behind Freya, a few Kurlutz nobles were squatting together and discussing in whispers. Under the white cloak was a pale blonde youth who seemed to have overindulged in sex. He was only 21 or 22 years old, but the emblem on his collar proved that he was an official knight. He said so with a mixed expression of disapproval and amusement, which caused a burst of low laughter. Another person laughed and said, but Lady Veronica actually listened to that guy's slanderous words and gave the little girl full command. It's unbelievable. The others shrugged as well. Just watch. She doesn't know how to command at all. How can we launch a charge at this distance? This is a glacier terrain, not hills or plains. The blonde youth shook his head. Broad, I heard that they graduated from the Erewhon Royal Knight Academy. I see. Browder raised his eyebrows. This distance was consistent with the distance specified in the drill, but Erewhon soldiers must lack experience in fighting on the snowy plains. Tactics should be adapted to local conditions. In his opinion, this woman was a rigid dogmatist. Let's wait and see. He glanced in that direction. They were all excellent soldiers, so they wouldn't disobey orders. However, he was certain that the other party would fail, so he couldn't help but look in that direction disapprovingly. Get everyone ready, the enemy might discover us first. They're just some private soldiers of Aween's nobles, they're just chickens and dogs. That bumpkin lord's judgment is somewhat reasonable. It's very likely that the ones below are just cannon fodder. We shouldn't encounter any trouble. He probably wants to train his commander so that we're out of luck. Behind Browder, a tall female knight with overly thin cheeks judged. He also wants us to pretend to be a dragon, oh whoa, one of them teased, putting his hands to his cheeks and imitating a dragon's roar. Ha ha ha. It caused a burst of low laughter all around. The low laughter finally caught Freya's attention. She took a light breath and looked back with some dissatisfaction, but she turned back with a frown. Don't worry about them. Maynard glanced at her and reminded her. I know. Freya nodded. This was the first battle that she had commanded in the truest sense, and she would never take it lightly. She raised her head, and her light brown eyes once again reflected the traces of the noble's private soldiers through the wind and snow. She couldn't help but think of the question that Brando had asked her. Please don't laugh anymore, Army Commander. Shido blushed in the wind and snow, looking very embarrassed. I'm sorry, Shido, but you really shouldn't regard the Erewhon people as barbarians. Ha ha, ha. Veronica narrowed her eyes, but she couldn't help but smile. She saw the senior girl turn around a little embarrassedly and explained, their late King Eric was also a noble of the Cruise people. In fact, the Erewhon people and the Cruise people have always been of the same root, but they also have their own culture. You followed those guys in the imperial capital. The things you learned were really biased. So only when you walk out of the door can you see the real world. Shido held the book, standing in the pure snow, and glanced in the direction of Brando. Will the Count be angry? No, he's not that petty. Let's go and have a look. He's probably the only one who would recognize that thing in front. Answered Veronica, clasping the furs round her neck, and clasping the hilt of her sword in one hand, she approached with a creak. Even you don't recognize it, Army Commander. Shido was a little surprised. Don't be curious, that little guy is a strange person. He said he learned these things from the files of the Black Tower wizards. Humph, I talked to William, it seems that there are some things that even he doesn't understand. This little guy must have some secrets on him. Veronica replied. The scholar was slightly startled and couldn't help but look in that direction curiously. Brando creaked over a thick glacier. He looked up and saw something in the distance that seemed to be standing on the edge of the sky. That thing naturally attracted people's attention, like the corner of a huge structure, as black as ink, obliquely inserted into the glacier, only a very small part of it was exposed. The whole corner exuded a metallic luster, and the surface of the metal was covered with light blue textures, sparkling, in a regular geometric pattern hanging from the top of the corner, densely covering the whole body of this thing. From a distance, it looked more like a temple sunk into the ground, but as he got closer, Brando felt a very familiar feeling, a bit like the creation of the Hazel people, full of a structure and an industrial style. He looked up, and could almost imagine the scene of that thing flying over here. It fell from mid-air and crashed into the ground. The energy that erupted instantly tore the earth apart, leaving deep marks on the ground. Then, it continued to slide into the distance until it lost all of its kinetic energy. Only then did it slowly stop. What followed was 1,000 years of ice, until today when they discovered it again. He slowly walked through the ravine-like valleys, which were formed thousands of years ago in this collision. The father of the frost giants, Milos, was buried here, and the ice and snow of thousands of years could prove it. He was a little lost, Mr. Brando. Until a voice sounded behind him, he turned around and saw Shido with a serious face. Do you know what this is? She looked up and looked at this great creation with some amazement. You mean that thing? Brando was a little distracted. He glanced at the black square column in the distant sky that seemed to go straight into the clouds, but his mind was not on it. This was not something important, and such scenery could be seen in many places in this glacier. It was like a background to the players, and there was no meaning in its existence. But it was indeed majestic. Brando looked up at the black column and said, "That's the body of Milos." What? Shido was stunned and stopped. That's the body of a god. Inevitably, the scholar showed a look of suspicion. She was well aware of her beauty, and some people often pretended to be knowledgeable in order to get close to her. She knew when she was in the academy that many of the legends she heard were actually fabricated. She now felt that this count was the same, because she felt that he could not look like a scholar, and even if he was, he might not dare to say such a thing. She looked at the huge ruins, and her heart could not accept such an explanation. You think I'm lying? Brando looked back and glanced at her, a little amused. At least this scholar had always been interesting to him. No. Shido hurriedly shook her head. But as a scholar, I must be responsible for my words. Have you really confirmed your words, my lord? This is still suspicion, Brando thought to himself. He replied, "This is actually not my words. The witch's dark prophecy recorded that in this battle, Milos disintegrated in mid-air, and the wreckage was scattered across the earth. Most of it fell into this glacier, but there was still one that fell into the Sea of the Dead Moon. The Bugas built a city on it called Onais. You should have heard of it, right? The ruins on the Sea of the Dead Moon are, or..." Shido stared at the black building in the sky. Almost, and in fact, both the Bugas and the Black Tower mages have confirmed this. These things we see now are the remains of Milos. In the future, you may have the opportunity to enter the White Tower to study the files of the Silver Mages, and you will come into contact with this precious knowledge, Miss Shido. When Brando said so himself, he also glanced at the Black Tower in the sky. Thank you, Shido replied softly. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have doubted your words. No need to apologize. There is a saying among scholars, doubt is the door to the truth. You should have heard of it, right? You know, Mr. Brando, are you really a scholar? Shido asked in surprise, holding the book. Ahem. I've just read the literature in this area. In fact, I'm not really a scholar. That's a pity. But Brando was a little absent-minded at this moment, thinking about the action on the other side. He heard creaking footsteps coming from behind, and by the sound, he knew it was Veronica. How about it, are you confident, little one? She had obviously heard the conversation between Brando and Shido, but at the moment, like Brando, her attention could not be focused on these legends and myths. Brando did not look back, but just nodded. Don't worry. Why are you so sure that Erek will really act according to this plan? Veronica frowned, but it was not that she did not believe in Brando. If she did not believe in Brando, she would not have agreed to Brando's plan. It's very simple. Brando replied. He looked back. P.S. I was discussing the plot with my book friends in the group tonight, so I'm going to update this chapter first. I'll make up for it tomorrow. It's miserable. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.